Chapter 1. January 1816. Constance closed the Bible and tiptoed toward the door. Ever since Lady Graves had fallen ill, she'd been cooped up inside, with the older woman refusing to allow her to leave the house at all. She didn't mind reading to the old woman while she was awake, but when she fell asleep? Why did anyone need to have the Book of Proverbs read to them while they were sleeping? And why the Book of Proverbs? Constance had once skipped over to the Song of Solomon while the elderly lady slept, and she'd read from it instead. Of course, Lady Graves had woken up in the middle of the passage and had been scandalized. Constance peeked back over her shoulder before opening the door. Good, she's still sleeping. She went down the back stairs and hurried out onto the grounds. If her employer was true to form, she would sleep for precisely 2 hours and 16 minutes. Constance didn't know how she did it, but her naps were always the exact same length. She hurried across the grounds to the small stream that separated Lady Graves' property from a small orphanage in amongst the trees. When she finally reached it, she sat down on the bank of the stream and hugged her knees to her chest. She knew it wasn't the right way for a lady to act, but she really didn't care. Her father had been a country squire, and she missed the freedom she'd had to run around doing as she wanted when she was a child. Both of her parents had died of influenza when she was 16, and she'd taken a post working for Lady Graves. She'd worked for the woman for 7 years, and she didn't know what she would do if something were to happen to her employer. The physician had come out several times and her health was failing. Constance knew she had to do something, but having always lived in the country, she didn't know where to go or what to do. She supposed she could always get a post in the small town near them, but she didn't know what skills she possessed. She'd been little more than a schoolgirl when she'd begun working for Lady Graves. She sighed, staring at the water and waiting for it to calm her. She saw a lone rider across the stream. She'd noticed him before, but had never spoken to him. She leaned back on her hands and watched, knowing he would never spot her. He was always so focused on his ride that little things like women watching him were not noticed. He looked as if he were one with his horse, riding along the edge of the stream. He was a superb horseman, and she dreamed of what it would be like if he offered her a hand up, and she rode along with him. Many nights, instead of sleeping, she would lie in bed and imagine a life with the mystery man. Constance thought about everything she knew about him. He must have a great deal of wealth to be able to afford such a beautiful animal. Obviously he didn't have a demanding job, because he was out quite often in the afternoon riding the same path. He didn't ever look around him as he rode, just concentrated on what was in front of him. He would often jump over a fallen limb instead of going around it, laughing as he landed soundly. For a few months, he'd been morose in his expressions as he rode, but for the past few weeks, he seemed happy again. She liked him better when he was happy, of course. He was so much more fun to watch. Constance sighed, forcing herself to think about her situation again. She had to find something else to do. Whether or not Lady Graves died, she was miserable in her position. She was not made to be a lady's companion. She would make a good governess, walking with children through the woods and talking about nature. She could see herself surrounded by children as she made her daily sojourns. Being with a crotchety old harridan? So much less enjoyable. She stood and brushed off her skirt. She had only 45 minutes left of her employer's nap, and she needed some food. Ever since Lady Graves had fallen ill and lost her appetite, she'd forgotten that Constance needed to eat. When she would ask if she could go to the kitchens to procure food, the answer was always the same. "I'm not hungry." "Why are you?" She hurried to the kitchen, forgetting about the mystery man on the horse for the time being. The cook had left a warm stew on the stove for her, knowing she would be hungry. Lady Graves had no children, so no one checked up on her. It was just Constance, Lady Graves, and a few servants living in the large house in the country. She sat at the table and ate her stew quickly, thanking the cook when she was done. "If you don't mind, I'd love it if you'd keep something set aside for me this evening. I'm certain she won't let me eat again. She's happy with chicken broth." "Why am I not happy with chicken broth?" Cook smiled at Constance. "You run on back to her, Connie. You know I'll save you some supper." "I always do." Constance smiled sweetly and ran from the room, up the stairs, and carefully opened the door to Lady Graves' room. She sat down in her chair, checking to see that her charge was still sleeping soundly. She picked up the Bible, and skipping over 3 proverbs, began reading in a soft modulated voice, knowing when Lady Graves woke, she would expect to hear her reading from further along than where she'd left off. She found herself constantly checking the time as she read. 2 hours later, her throat hoarse, she stood and checked on her employer. Placing her hand against her forehead, she realized it was ice cold. Constance tried to stifle the panic as she picked up the woman's wrist and checked her pulse. When she didn't find one, she ran down the stairs and asked the maid to send for the physician, even though she knew it was too late. Constance returned to her employer's room, buried her face in her hands, and cried. She didn't know if she was crying for her employer or for herself, but her life was about to change, and she didn't know where she'd be sleeping in a week. She knew nothing of the older woman's will, but she was certain whoever inherited would not put up with the former owner's companion living there. What was she going to do? Charles once again felt eyes on him as he rode, but as usual, he assumed some of the orphans had wandered off and onto Lady Graves' property. He'd speak to Lily about it, because Lady Graves was the type to chase orphans off her property with a blunt instrument if she could find one. He rode at breakneck speed back across the meadow toward Marsgate Manor. He'd been away from London for a while, and he found he was thinking about going back. He missed Lily, and their brother, James, was still in Scotland. What he was doing there, Charles didn't know, but he rarely knew what James was up to. He gave his reins to the groom in the stable, before walking toward the house. He'd been feeling restless for weeks, ever since Lily had married Kit. He needed to check on her, but he didn't want it to be obvious he was worried about her. He didn't want her new husband to think he didn't trust him. He frowned. How could he trust Kit when he'd impregnated his sister without being married to her? Yes, he'd done the right thing when she'd turned up pregnant, and had promised him he'd be good to her, but he still worried. Lily hadn't wanted to marry him, but she'd known it was the best thing for her unborn child. He sighed. I'll just ride over there at dinner time. She won't refuse me a meal, and I can see them together and make certain she's okay. Lily was glowing. She looked positively radiant and happy when she joined him in the parlor before dinner. She rushed to him and hugged him close. It's so good to see you, Charles. Charles pulled away and looked down at his younger sister, his brown eyes carefully studying her pretty face. I thought you weren't speaking to me. Lily laughed. I wasn't speaking to you because you forced me to marry a beast when I didn't want to marry. Now I'm thanking you for encouraging me to marry my wonderful husband whom I love with all my heart. Charles threw back his head and laughed. I guess I don't have to ask if you're happy. I'm very happy. She patted her round belly. Ready for this baby to be born, but very happy. It's not time to have him yet. You keep my nephew in there for just as long as he wants to stay. We don't need a tiny scrawny baby. Lily rolled her eyes. What if it's a girl? Charles shrugged. If it's a girl, you need to force her to wear shoes every day from the day she's born so she won't end up like her mother with a shoe aversion. Lily blushed, looking down quickly and then back up with a smile. You were checking to make certain your feet were hidden under your gown, weren't you? Lily, you are going to be the death of us all. She smiled as Kit came into the room and slipped his arm around her waist. He held his hand out to Charles. What brings you this way? Charles raised an eyebrow. The last time I saw my sister, she told me she'd never speak to me again because I forced her to marry you. I felt the need to check on her and make sure she was all right. Kit smiled, his face having healed nicely from the black eye Charles had given him a few weeks before. My wife and I are doing very well, thank you. Then I'm here for dinner. Charles followed the couple to the dining room and carefully observed them as they ate. He could see the love shining on both of their faces, so he was content. If Lily was happy, then that was all that mattered. He needed his sister to be happy. So, Charles, when are you going to marry? Lily asked the question just as Charles was taking a sip of his wine, and he choked on it. I'm not in any hurry, Charles told her. I haven't met the woman of my dreams yet. Lily shrugged. How are you going to meet her when you hide yourself away in the country all the time? And when you do go to London, all you do is attend parliamentary meetings. Don't you think you should go to some balls? Check out the new crop of marriage-minded misses? Charles wiped his mouth with his napkin. The new crop of marriage-minded misses? Is that a phrase you came up with on your own? Oh yes, but I suppose I should have said, the new mass of marriage-minded misses. That suits them better, and mass starts with an M. I'm all for good alliteration. Charles shook his head at his sister. When I'm ready to marry, I'll check out the ballrooms. For now, I'm content. Lily smiled at him. You never know when love will come along and force you to change your stance on that. As you said, I hide in the country when I'm not at Parliament. How will love find me here? You never know. He took the long way home that evening, riding to the edge of the lake that was right near the orphanage. He spotted a fountain by the light of the full moon that he hadn't seen before. He stopped and got down, looking at it with a smile. He had no idea who had put it there, but the craftsmanship was superb. He would have liked to have one built for his garden at home. While he was studying it, he thought about what Lily had said. He never knew where love would find him. He laughed to himself. If love finds me here in the country, I promise I will not let it go. Constance stayed at the manor house until after the funeral. She'd been going out daily looking for a new position, but nothing was available. Finally, just the day before, she found something. It wasn't ideal, but at least she wouldn't be living in the woods by the stream. She stood over the grave, sad that no one else had deigned to show up for the burial. It was her and the other servants from the house, all of whom were currently trying to find new positions. It was much easier to find a job as a maid or a cook than as a lady's companion or governess, though. How she wished she could find another job as a lady's companion or a governess. After the funeral, she took her small bag from where she'd hidden it behind a tombstone, and began the long walk into town. There was a small seamstress shop, and she'd been hired to work at the front desk, because her accent was genteel, and the owner thought it would bring in more upper-class clientele. She would have a bed in a small room behind the store, but she must share the room with another young woman whom she had yet to meet. She sighed. It was better than having nowhere to live. It had to be better than having nowhere to live, right? She had to walk around a small lake to get to town, and she stopped to sit for a moment on a tree stump. The tree had been cut down a long time before, but the stump was the perfect seat, and by the smooth top, she could tell she wasn't the first person to sit there. She squinted out into the distance as she rested, wondering what the next day, her first day working in the shop, would bring. She'd been raised to believe she would marry a member of the gentry and raise children. Never had she dreamed she'd work for a living. Finally, rested enough, she stood and walked toward town again. As she reached the edge of the lake, she saw a fountain, and stopped to look at it. It was majestic, each stone chosen and placed with care. She knew nothing about stoneworking, but even she could see that the fountain was something special. She ran her hand over the front of it, and with a laugh, made a wish on it. She had simple needs, so she wished for the only thing that came to mind. I wish the man on the horse would find me and take me away to a better life. She opened her eyes and walked on, knowing it had been silly to waste her time that way. When she arrived in town, she went to the shop and was shown her room. Her roommate would be one of the other women who worked in the shop. She had been raised in the orphanage that was so close to Lady Grave's property. She seemed to be polite and sweet, and Constance said a prayer of thanks that she wouldn't be sharing a room with an unsavory woman. I made room for your things, Alice told her. I thought you'd want to have a place to put your clothes. Thank you, Alice. I really appreciate it. I think you'll like working for Mrs. Jackson. She's good to us. As long as we work hard, she pays us on time and gives us breaks. Alice smiled. She was a young woman of 18 or so, and Constance felt that she should have had more time to stay in the orphanage, but she also understood that there wasn't room for too many children, especially those that were old enough to live on their own. Constance put her things away and walked over to sit on the small bed. I appreciate you sharing your room with me, she told the younger girl. Oh, I really don't mind. I'm used to sharing my space after growing up in the orphanage. Constance smiled. She had been living and working on her own for 2 years when she was Alice's age. Had she seemed so young back then? Constance found her days quickly settled into a routine. Most of the customers in the shop were country gentry, and she found herself missing her old lifestyle, but she truly didn't mind the work. It was nice to be free to spend part of her day walking around the small village, and she could eat outside on her lunch break when the weather was nice. She'd been at the shop for a little over a week when a very pregnant lady came into the shop. "May I help you?" Constance asked. The woman smiled and nodded. "I want to order 2 new dresses to make it through the next few months, and I'd like to see Alice while I'm here if I may." "Of course." Constance pushed the book with the dress designs toward the lady and hurried to the back. "Alice, there's someone here to see you." Alice looked up from the dress she was hemming and set it down carefully before walking to the front. The owner gave her a look that clearly said she was not to spend too long with the visitor, no matter who it was. When Alice got to the front of the shop, she let out a squeal and rushed into the lady's open arms. "Lady Lily. It's been ages since you visited me." She stepped back and looked at the other woman's swollen belly. "You got married?" Lady Lily laughed. "I married Lord Christopher." She smiled at the younger girl. "I was hoping I could take you out to tea. Would your employer mind?" Alice bit her lip. "I don't know. She doesn't usually want us leaving the store in the middle of the day." "Then come for dinner, but you need to bring a companion." "I'll send the coach for you, of course, but I don't want you even getting out of a coach and going into your room at night without someone with you." Lady Lily looked at Constance. "Will you come?" Alice smiled and walked to stand beside Constance. "This is my friend and roommate, Constance. She would love to come with me." Constance looked at the younger girl. "I don't want to be an imposition. I can ride out with you and wait in the coach if you'd like." Lady Lily frowned. "You will do no such thing. I'll send the coach for you at 6. The shop is closed at 5, isn't it?" Alice nodded. "It is." "Oh, I can't wait to catch up with you and Lord Christopher. All of us always hoped you'd marry, you know." Lily blushed slightly. "I always hoped we would too." She pushed Alice toward the back. "Get back to work so you don't get into trouble, and I'll see you this evening." Alice hurried to the back of the shop and left Lily alone with Constance. "What type of dress are you looking for?" Constance asked, all business. Lily sighed. "I don't know. All of my dresses have been taken out as much as they can be, and I'm ready for something different. Something in cotton that I can work in easily." Constance looked at the other woman with surprise on her face. "Work? Surely you don't work." Lily laughed. "I work with the orphans and have for years. That's how I know Alice." Constance smiled, understanding then. "Until a couple of weeks ago, I was a companion for Lady Graves. Her land bordered the orphanages. I used to sit by the stream there and watch the children when I could." Lily's eyes brightened. "I think I've seen you there. I lived on the other side of the orphanage from Lady Graves. I was Lily Marsgate until I married." "Oh. I know of your family." Of course, everyone in the county did. Her brother was the Earl of Marsgate, the highest-ranked gentleman in the area. "It's nice to meet you." Lily smiled. "It's very nice to meet you as well. I'm glad Alice has someone staying with her now. She never liked being alone. She always had one of the younger orphans with her. Well, I look forward to talking with you this evening." Constance changed the topic back to the dresses Lily was ordering, and between them they found 2 that could easily be taken in after the baby was born and still look stylish. Lily sighed. "I don't know why I bother worrying about that, though. With as quickly as I got pregnant with this one, I think I'm going to spend the next 15 years or so carrying babies." Constance looked at the other woman with wide eyes. She couldn't believe she'd said that to her. A moment later, a male head popped into the shop. "Lily, are you almost finished?" Lily sighed. "I'll be finished in a moment, Kit. I invited Alice and her roommate for dinner. Kit shrugged. What's two more? He saw that Lily was the only customer in the shop and stepped in behind her, his hands automatically stroking her shoulders. I have work to do when you finally finish shopping, you know. His words were harsh, but the look of love he had for his wife made Constance smile. That's what she wanted. She didn't care if the man in her life was a farmer or a king. She wanted a man who loved her the way Kit obviously loved Lily. Chapter 2. Constance and Alice waited outside the shop for the coach that evening, and Alice talked about Lady Lily. She was so good to us orphans. She was there every day and helped with meals and brought us all gifts. She wiped a tear from her eye. I had never in my life had a toy that was just mine before Lady Lily. She and her maid made dolls for each of us girls, and they brought little toy soldiers and horses for the boys. It made us feel so loved. Constance smiled. She sounds like a good woman. Oh, she is. You're going to love her. Alice was practically bouncing up and down with her excitement. I can't believe she came to the shop just to see me. She saw the coach slowly rolling to a stop and hurried over, scrambling up before the coachman had a chance to put down the steps. Constance waited, having ridden in a coach many times during her childhood. She understood manners a great deal better than young Alice ever would. When they reached the house, Constance was surprised it wasn't larger than it was. Lord Christopher must not be an earl like Lady Lily's brother, not that it mattered to Constance, because she had never lived in a house even close to that size. Lily invited them both in, and they sat in the small parlor as if she entertained girls who worked in dress shops every day. While they waited for their meal, the three talked about the baby that was coming, and Lily said she wanted some special clothes made. She looked at Alice. That's one of the reasons I came to see you. I remember how skilled you are with a needle and thought maybe you could use the extra money. Alice nodded eagerly. I would love to, but you don't have to pay me. You've done so much for me. Let me just do it as a gift for the baby. She smiled at Lily's stomach. When did you and Lord Christopher marry? And why didn't I know about it? Lily blushed. We married last month. Alice's mouth dropped open. But, last month? Constance could see both women were uncomfortable with the topic and quickly changed the subject. Are you hoping for a boy? Lily nodded. I think so. I would love to have a little girl who I could teach to climb trees, but Kit needs a little boy to inherit. She shrugged. He was third in line and ended up being the Viscount, so we should probably have a whole passel of boys before we start on girls. Constance grinned. You want to teach little girls to climb trees? She was certain she must have heard incorrectly. Oh yes. I met Kit when I was 6 and sitting in a tree as he wandered down a path on the grounds of my father's estate. It sounds like a fascinating story. Constance didn't feel like she knew the other woman well enough to ask, but hoped she'd share it. Oh, it is. I'll tell you about it sometime. Lily looked up as the butler came to the door of the parlor. Your brother is here, Lady Lily. Lily got to her feet slowly, her belly slowing her down. She hurried across the room to hug her brother tightly. Charles, you came. I wasn't certain you'd make it. Charles hugged Lily close. Of course, I made it. My favorite sister asked me to dinner, so I'm here for dinner. Lily smiled at him. I'm your only sister. That will never stop me from accepting your invitation. He looked at the women seated on the small sofa. Why don't you introduce me to your friends? Lily smiled. Charles, this is Alice. She was one of the orphans, but she works at the dress shop in town now. Charles nodded his head regally. So nice to meet you, Alice. Alice smiled at the man. It's nice to meet you too. We were all thankful that you allowed Lady Lily to spend so much time with us. Charles tilted his head to the side, studying his sister. Yes, it was kind of me, wasn't it? Lily rolled her eyes and swatted at Charles's arm. And her friend there is Constance. She was a companion to Lady Graves before her death. Charles nodded at Constance. I'm sorry for your loss. Constance stared at the man, her heart skipping a beat. It was the man on the horse. "Thank you," she mumbled softly. She couldn't believe he was right there in front of her. She'd wanted to meet him for years, and suddenly, when circumstances should have made it impossible for them to ever cross paths, he was there. Charles looked at Constance. "You look familiar." Constance blushed, not willing to tell him where he'd seen her. "I shouldn't. I've been a companion for Lady Graves for 6 years, and before that I was just a daughter of a poor country squire. We never had occasion to meet." His eyes were just as brown as she'd imagined they would be. She hoped her face didn't have a worshipful look on it, because that's how she felt toward him. "Have you always lived in Devon?" he asked, obviously still trying to figure out where he knew her from. She nodded. "My entire life." He shook his head. "I know I've seen you. It will come to me eventually." He turned to Lily. "So we're having dinner with a former orphan who happens to work in a dress shop. I love you for that." Lily grinned and shrugged. "Honestly? I forgot that I'd invited you when I invited them. You don't mind, though, right?" "Of course not." He smiled at the two women on the couch. "Our numbers are uneven, so I'll have to escort you both." Constance shook her head. "No, just escort Alice." She knew the younger girl would get a thrill from being escorted to dinner by an earl. He shook his head adamantly. "I couldn't do that. If I escort her, I have to escort you as well." He grinned down at her. "I have 2 arms." Constance nodded, giving in. "That sounds fine then." She knew they'd make a funny group, but what did it matter? It was just the 5 of them, and obviously Lady Lily and Lord Christopher knew Lord Charles was odd. Lord Christopher came into the room then and stood beside Lily. He held his hand out to shake Charles's. "How are things at Marsgate?" Charles shrugged. "Same as usual. I think I've finally convinced James that he can come home from Scotland." "Good. Lily will be pleased to see him." The butler stepped into the room then, to announce dinner was ready. Kit took Lily into dinner, and Charles followed with Constance on one arm and Alice on the other. As soon as Constance touched Charles's arm, she felt as if a jolt of electricity shot through her. What was it about this man that made her feel so strongly? Charles looked down at Constance with surprise. Who was this woman, and how did he know her? He felt as if he'd met her before, and he needed to know how. She was a beauty, and he wanted nothing more than to get to know her better. Would she agree to him taking her home that evening? All through dinner, Charles watched Constance, and she watched her food, not daring to look up. She didn't want him to realize that she'd been watching him for years. It would be humiliating for him to know he'd taken on the role of her dream man. Charles had never felt so attracted to a woman in his life. What was it about the beauty sitting at his sister's table? If he hadn't known better, he'd have assumed that she was a member of the nobility. Her manners and her motions imitated the upper class perfectly. He so badly wanted to get to know her better. "Who is your father?" he asked. Constance looked up at Charles in surprise. "He was Stanley Smythe. He died when I was 16. "Is that how you became a companion?" She nodded. "When he and my mother died, I needed somewhere to go, and Lady Graves offered me the job. She knew my father." He frowned. "You had no other family? At 16? How could anyone have been stuck with that old woman at such a tender age?" "No, it was just my parents and me." She brought another spoonful of soup to her lips, wondering why he was asking her so many questions. "I didn't end up in an orphanage." She looked at Alice and smiled at the younger girl who was in a conversation with Lily and Kit. He frowned. "I knew Lady Graves. You may have been better off in an orphanage. She wasn't the most nurturing woman I ever met." Constance chuckled. "No, nurturing was not one of her qualities. She did pay me a steady wage and give me food and shelter, and I shall be forever grateful to her for that. Not many people would have taken on a 16-year-old companion." "What are you doing now?" Charles hoped she was between positions. He could find something for her to do. He needed to keep her close, however that could happen. I'm working at the same dress shop as Alice. The owner put me at the front desk because my accent is more genteel, and she's hoping it will bring in more customers. She didn't add that the woman was hoping for a higher class of clientele than she was used to, because the words were implied. I see. He leaned back in his chair as his soup was taken from him and replaced with the main course. How do you like working there? Oh, it's nice. I get regular breaks, and I have my evenings all to myself. I have no complaints at all. Her words told him a lot about what life had been like for her under Lady Graves' roof. You're happy there? She shrugged. I don't know if I'd say happy, but I'm content. I have work that I'm good at, and no one is yelling at me. It's a good life for someone in my position. She nodded to Alice. I even have a room behind the store that I share with Alice. Charles closed his eyes. The picture she painted for him was grim. She'd been raised to be of a higher class than she was living in, and he wondered that she didn't rage about the unfairness of the world. Instead, she calmly accepted that she was doing what she needed to do. He couldn't help but admire her for that. He thought about positions he had in his house that he could offer her. He knew there was nothing that was comparable to being a companion, though. Wouldn't you rather be a lady's companion again, or a governess? He could picture her with a child on her lap, smiling into the child's eyes. I have no references. My only employer has died, so I don't have a way of finding another position like that. I don't need more than I have. The last words were a reminder for herself. Every time she looked at Lord Charles, she wanted a great deal more than she had. He sighed. He didn't agree with her at all. Will you let me see you home this evening? He asked. He wanted to make her an offer. It wasn't one he could make in front of his sister, but it was one that would make him very happy and would get her away from the life she was living. She shook her head with a smile. I can't. I was only invited this evening so that Alice wouldn't have to be out alone at night. I need to accompany her home. He sighed. He'd let her go for now, but he'd find out where she worked and look in on her the next day. He had to talk to her alone if at all possible. Constance looked back down at her food. What was going through his mind? She'd never had a man show so much interest in her before. He was an earl. There was no way he could be interested in her romantically, could he? As much as she wanted to believe he was, she couldn't. She had a firm grasp on reality, and she knew that no earl could ever be interested in her. Charles had to get to know her better. He didn't know what it was about Constance Smythe, but he was definitely smitten. If she was of the nobility, he would be at her father's door, begging for her hand in marriage. As it was, he had no idea what he should do. He knew where the seamstress shop was. If he could go there, he could get to know her, ask her, what? His father had pounded into his head for years that he needed to marry the daughter of an earl or a duke. A Marsgate never marries beneath him. H had to have her, though. How could he live the rest of his life without her face smiling at him in the mornings? He'd get to know her and ask her to be his mistress. He cringed at the words even as he thought them. He was going to ask the woman that he wanted to spend the rest of his life with to be his mistress? If she slapped him in the face, it would be nothing less than he deserved. He couldn't not ask, though. It was better than being alone for the rest of his life. Wasn't it? It had to be. Chapter 3. When the bell over the shop door tinkled the following morning, Constance automatically looked up and smiled her greeting. She froze when she saw it was Charles standing before her. What was he doing here? He didn't even have a wife to buy dresses for. How can I help you, my lord? Charles leaned on the counter in front of her. May I take you to lunch today? She shook her head. I can't go to lunch with you. How could he think she would? You can't be seen with a shop girl. You're an earl. He shrugged. Being an earl means that I can be seen with whomever I choose to be seen with. In London it might be a problem, but not here in Devon. He took her hand in his. Please, Constance, have lunch with me. I want to get to know you better. I can't. She turned from him and put the orders received that morning into the basket that was meant for the seamstresses. If she got to know him better, she knew she would just fall deeper in love with him. Her heart was already aching for him and she barely knew him. Getting to know him better was the last thing she should do. Then meet me after work. I want to talk to you. His voice was begging her to do as he wanted. She shook her head. I can't. He studied her for a moment before taking the book of dresses off the counter. I want to order 5 dresses, please. The words were loud and rang out through the shop. Constance turned back to face him. And who are you buying them for, my lord? 5 dresses? Mrs. Jackson would be thrilled for the order, but why would he order them? He shrugged. For anyone who needs dresses, I suppose. If you'll only talk to me as part of your workday, then you can sell me some dresses. I'll buy them for you. She stared at him in shock. You can't buy me dresses. It wouldn't be proper. He sighed heavily. Who can I buy dresses for then? There had to be someone he was allowed to buy dresses for. He was the only man in the world who could fall in love with a girl who worked in a dress shop who was worried about propriety. Didn't women in dress shops all want to find a way to get out of them? She looked at him with wide eyes, considering his question. Your sister is the only woman I can think of. It's not terribly proper for you to pick out her dresses, but it's not something that would be scandalous either. My sister? Of course. Let's buy Lily some dresses. Do you have her measurements? He grasped the idea with both hands, willing to jump right in. Constance nodded. Yes, she was here and ordered 2 new dresses yesterday. He smiled at her, taking her hand in his. Well, then we can order dresses for Lily. Do you have any you would like to recommend? She snatched her hand from his, looking over her shoulder to be certain that Mrs. Jackson wasn't watching. I know what she chose yesterday, so we can look at some of the other dresses that would look good in her last months, but can be taken in after the baby is born. She flipped through the book quickly to find the right page. What about this one? She asked. He stared at her face as he said, just beautiful. Her heart skipped a beat. Why was he pursuing her so relentlessly? What had she done to catch his interest this way? What color would you like it in? He shrugged. What color would you recommend? Constance sighed. Green? To match her eyes? Lady Lily has beautiful eyes. They were huge when she was little. She was always sneaking out of the house while her governess slept. She wasn't supposed to, but she hated being inside, and that particular governess hated being outdoors. I almost think she pretended to nap half the time to get Lily to sneak out so she wouldn't have to go with her. She laughed. It sounds like she was a real handful. He nodded, enjoying her laugh. How could he convince her to spend time with him? She was. I don't know how father kept finding governesses for her. She ran them all off, one by one. He finally just had my aunt move in to teach her to be a lady. Constance smiled. It seems to have worked out for him. She certainly acted like a lady today. That's because you didn't check to see if she had shoes on under her dress. Anytime she entertains, she's careful to wear a full skirt so no one can see that she's barefoot. Charles shook his head. Father was mortified. She covered her mouth with her hand and giggled. She sounds perfectly dreadful and wonderful all at the same time. Charles smiled, his mouth quirking up slightly on one side. Yes, she was dreadful to anyone who tried to turn her into a lady, but she was also a wonderful girl. She's become a wonderful woman. She teaches all the orphans to read and write, all the while making them all feel important. She's going to be a wonderful mother. Constance nodded. She is. I've never met anyone quite like her. He caught her hand, keeping her from finishing writing up the order she was filling out for him. I've never met anyone like you, either. His eyes pled with hers. Please let me take you to lunch today. I want to get to know you better. She stared down at the counter separating them, wishing he would stop asking her to do things she desperately wanted to do, but knew she shouldn't. I just can't. I'm sorry, my lord. He sighed, and left a short time later after paying for all the dresses he'd purchased. The gifts began arriving a few hours later. The single red rose was first, and she brought it to her nose and sniffed it, running it to the back and putting it on the single dresser in the small room she shared with Alice. Alice waited at the front while she did, claiming she needed to go to the necessary. She didn't want to get into trouble, but she also didn't want her employer to see the rose. Next was a pair of white elbow-length gloves, the kind a lady would wear for a ball. She took them out of the long white box they were inside and smiled. She would never have occasion to wear something like that, but she treasured them just the same. By the end of the day, the counter was covered with many small gifts. A blue ribbon, a book of poems with a page marked in it that she told herself she'd read later, a bouquet of daisies, and lastly, a pretty white shawl. She did her best to hide everything off to one side, but she knew her employer was watching her. "Do you have an admirer, Constance?" Mrs. Jackson asked in her carefully practiced voice. She'd told Constance that her accent had once been perfectly dreadful, but she'd worked very hard to make it sound like she was from a higher class than she was. Her voice still didn't have the perfectly modulated tones of the upper class, but she preferred not to work in front of the store anyway. Constance blushed. "I don't know what I have." Mrs. Jackson looked over the gifts that had been pushed aside. "I need you to ask him to stop sending you gifts here. You may receive them in your room, but not during business hours." It was too distracting. Constance nodded, her head down. She didn't want to get in trouble when she'd just begun her job. "I'll try." "What do you mean you'll try?" Constance sighed. "I don't know how to get a message to him." Mrs. Jackson shook her head. "The gifts must stop." "Yes, ma'am." Once she was in her room, Constance looked at Alice. "How am I going to stop him?" "He's an Earl." Alice shrugged. "I guess we need to walk over there and tell him he's endangering your job." "I don't even know how to get to his home." Constance felt the panic welling up inside her. She really didn't want to have to tell Charles that his gifts were unacceptable. She couldn't lose her job over it, though. It wasn't like the man would marry her to take her away from her life of drudgery. "I do. I had to go there to take a gift to Lady Lily once." Constance thought about it for a moment, looking out the window. It would be dark before too long, and she didn't want to be on the road at night. "How long will it take us to get there and back?" "Oh, the walk will take about an hour, but he'll have someone drive us back." Alice opened the door and pulled Constance outside with her. "The weather is clear. It will be fine." As they walked, the two women chatted about their day. Constance was a decent seamstress, but she was needed at the front of the shop, so she knew little about what went on in the back. All the girls were asking about the gifts, and how you know Lord Charles. "Did you explain that I just met him last night?" Constance asked. She still couldn't understand why the man had become so fixated on her. "I did, and that's when it got even worse." They wondered what could have happened during dinner at his sister's house to make him fall in love. Constance sighed. "He's not in love. He hasn't even told me what he wants other than to have lunch with me. He wants to marry you and show you what a life of leisure is. You can be his countess and sit in the parlor all day doing nothing." Alice's voice took on a dreamy quality as she spoke. Obviously she loved the idea of a man taking her away from her life of hard work. Constance laughed. "You've read one too many fairy tales, my friend. All a man like that wants from me is sexual favors." Alice shrugged. "If you get to live in his fine house with him and he loves you, what difference does that make?" "I can't live that way. I know I'm not meant to be the wife of a nobleman, especially not an earl. I need to encourage him to move on and leave me to live my life." Constance felt her resolve strengthening as she said the words. As the gifts had piled up that afternoon, she'd wondered if it would be so terrible to be a nobleman's mistress, but she couldn't do it. There was no stability. If he decided he was tired of her after a week or two, where would that leave her? What about children? She couldn't bear to have children who would never be recognized by their father. No, she had to stay strong, no matter how she felt about him. She thought about his brown eyes, and her heart began to melt a little. but she hardened it again. Alice sighed. He's the best-looking man in the whole county, and even better, he's the richest. How could you say no to that? Constance sighed. I can't let myself rely on a man. I need to rely on myself. If I became his mistress, and he tired of me, where would I be? What if we had children together? She loved the idea of spending her life with Lord Charles, but not as his mistress. She couldn't do that. Then you wouldn't be alone any longer. Alice's voice had a wistful air to it. Obviously she'd thought a great deal about what it would be like to be the mistress to a powerful nobleman. Constance put her hand through Alice's arm. I'm not alone. I have you. Alice laughed. So you do. And when you're the wife or mistress of Lord Charles, you can hire me to be your lady's maid. I promise I'll do your hair just the way you say, and call you Lady Constance. Constance laughed. I promise not to hit you with my fan if you get in my way too often, and I'll always remember your name. I might call you maid or girl on occasion, but I'll always remember that your name is really Althea. Oh, so kind of you. They continued bantering back and forth as they walked, dreaming up more and more ludicrous things Constance could do once she was Lord Charles's wife. They were laughing uproariously by the time they reached Marsgate Manor, and Constance found herself suddenly nervous as she stared up at the old house. I don't know what I'm going to say to him. Alice hugged her friend. Just tell him that he's going to get you sacked. Be clear. She walked to the front of the house and sat down on a bench. I'll wait here. Constance looked at Alice, and wished she could ask her to stay with her while she went inside, but she knew that was cowardly. She walked to the door and raised her hand to knock, and found it wrenched open before she could. Charles stood in front of her, and gave her a surprised look. I was just about to come to town to badger you to eat dinner with me. Constance sighed. We really need to talk, my lord. He opened the door wider to let her inside. Come to my study. He led the way down the long hall, and Constance followed behind, staring around the house. She had never seen such a fine home, and she felt more determined than ever to get him to leave her alone. She didn't belong in his world, and he would never fit in with hers. He led her to the study, but instead of taking his seat behind the desk, he sat on the couch across the room. The couch was blue with huge overstuffed cushions. He sat in the middle, so she stood looking down at him, wondering where he wanted her. You can't keep sending me gifts. Mrs. Jackson is threatening to sack me if it doesn't stop. He patted the cushion beside him, obviously waiting for her to be seated before responding. Sit with me, and we'll talk. She sighed. There's no room with you taking up the middle as you are. Constance wanted nothing more than to sit close beside him, snuggled against him, but she knew it was a mistake. Before she'd met him, Lord Charles had held a mysterious power over her. Now that she knew him? She didn't think she'd ever be able to stay away. He caught her hand and pulled her down beside him, his arm immediately going around her shoulders. See? Plenty of room. He leaned over and brushed his lips across her cheek. She tried to jerk away from him, but he held her against him. This isn't proper, my lord. No, it isn't, and please, call me Charles. He looked down into her eyes as he spoke softly to her. I tried to do things properly. I asked if I could drive you home last night. I asked if I could take you to lunch today. I've tried everything proper I know to do. Now, I'm doing improper things. His eyes held hers as he spoke, and he slowly lowered his head to brush his lips against hers. Constance put her hands on his chest to push him away, but found she couldn't do it. Her hands slowly wound around his neck, and she pressed closer to him. What would one kiss hurt? One kiss to store in her memory forever. He angled his head and deepened the kiss, his tongue tracing the outline of her lips. When she gasped softly at the feel of his tongue on her, he took advantage and slipped his tongue into her mouth, slowly stroking hers. She had never been kissed, had never dreamed that a man would kiss her this way. She clung to his shoulders, her heart pounding madly. No one had prepared her for the feelings that rushed through her. Her breasts were pressed against his hard chest, and her body tingled from head to toe. She broke the kiss, panting softly. "I can't let you kiss me like that again," she whispered, surprised she'd allowed it the first time. Charles sighed. "That's all I've been able to think about since the moment I saw you in my sister's parlor yesterday. You take my breath away, Constance. You make me think about forever, and that's not something I've done in a long time. It can't be. I'm sorry, I have to work, and my employer made it very clear that you are a distraction she's not willing to allow back in the shop. The gifts have to stop as well." She tried to keep her voice calm and even, but it sounded odd to her ears. "I have to be able to earn a living, and there are very few places in a small village like ours that will hire a single woman. So stop working. Come and live with me. Let me take care of you." He didn't know where the words came from. He'd never had a mistress live in his home, and he knew it wasn't the right thing to do. He couldn't let her go, though. The idea of her working bothered him. She should be in his home, sitting on his sofa reading books or doing embroidery. She needed to be his. He wanted her to have his child growing within her and another on her lap. "I can't be your mistress, Charles. It's not in my nature. When I fall in love, I'll be in love forever. There won't be a stream of men through my life." She didn't add that she was already in love, because it wasn't any of his concern if he wanted her to be his mistress. "I'm asking you for your forever. Spend it with me. Live here with me. I won't put you in a house somewhere and forget you. I want you to share my life." How could he convince her that his feelings were real? He didn't just want to have relations with her. He wanted love. She sighed heavily. "I'd love to share your life, but I can't be untrue to myself to do it." She stood up. "Please stop sending me gifts." What else could she say to convince him? He had to stop. She didn't want to be alone and without a position for the third time in her life. He stood with her. "I won't send any more gifts, if you'll have dinner with me tomorrow night. We won't go anywhere public if that bothers you. We can have a quiet dinner right here." He watched her face and knew she was about to tell him she couldn't. "If you don't have dinner with me, I'll send you a puppy to the shop, and we'll see what happens to your job then." "You wouldn't. A puppy would destroy everything. She couldn't have an animal there." She shook her head, annoyed that he would even threaten such a thing. Charles caught her hips with his hands and pulled her flush against him. "I'd do anything for another moment with you. I'd give everything I own for another kiss. All I'm asking for is dinner. You have to eat. Eat with me." He knew he was being obnoxious. He just didn't care if it meant she would be with him. Constance closed her eyes, knowing she needed to tell him no, but afraid she would lose her job if she did. Finally she nodded. "I'll have dinner with you." What choice did she really have? She could handle one evening alone with him. Right? His mouth swept down and he kissed her again, this one obviously a victory kiss. He kissed her sweetly, his hands cupping her face as his lips made slow love to hers. She moaned, wanting to spend the rest of the night right there in his arms. What was this power he had over her that he could make her act so wanton just by kissing her? When he finally lifted his head, he asked, "Did you walk out here?" She nodded. "Alice is waiting for me outside." She brought her hand to her lips, touching them as if they were foreign objects. Never had she felt such passion, and all from one kiss? She would burn alive if he ever did more to her. "I'll take you home then. Wait here." He left the room for a moment, calling to a servant to have the coach readied. "We'd better go get Alice out of the cold. Lily would never forgive me if she froze on my front porch." Constance smiled. "It's not that cold out." She was happy that he was worried about her friend. She didn't want Alice catching a cold and missing any work. She was a good friend to her, the first she'd had in a lot of years. Alice came into the room, followed by Charles, and she was rubbing her arms. That was a long talk. Constance blushed slightly. If they'd only talked, she wouldn't feel guilty at all. Instead, they'd kissed. Would she ever be able to close her eyes without feeling what his lips felt like on hers again? I'm sorry I left you sitting out in the cold so long. Lord Charles is going to take us home if that's any consolation. Alice nodded smiling as she rushed to the fireplace, still briskly rubbing her arms. I'm glad we don't have to make the walk in the cold and dark. She looked at the older woman. I told you he'd take us home. Constance nodded. Yes, you did. She stood beside her friend, across the room from Charles. Alice smiled at Charles. You're practically considered a saint at the orphanage. She grinned at the look on Charles's face. Charles looked startled by her words. Why's that? I've only been there a few times. How could anyone think he was something special? He did nothing for the orphans that Lily hadn't browbeaten him into doing. Because you let Lady Lily teach us every day when she was here, and you helped support us financially. You made things better for us all. I did what Lily wanted me to do. Alice nodded. Your father never helped us, but you've been wonderful. She turned back to the fire to rub her hands together to warm. Thank you for all you did for us. I wish I could have done more, he said. I know you had to leave as soon as you were old enough to be on your own. We all need to do more so you have a little more time to find positions. You've done so much more than most. Constance watched the exchange between the two of them with surprise. Charles seemed to be very embarrassed by the praise from Alice, which she found interesting. Most of the noblemen of her acquaintance had bragged about everything they did when they helped others. To see someone do it quietly surprised her a great deal. It showed her a new aspect to Charles that she admired more than she was willing to admit, even to herself. Chapter 4. Constance found herself watching the clock all through the following day. Charles would be there to take her to his home for dinner at 6, and she was both nervous and excited. Alice had squealed when she told her she'd agreed to have dinner with him just to get him to stop sending gifts to the shop. As soon as they finished work, Alice pushed Constance onto her bed and fussed with her hair. Oh, you need to wear it just so for Lord Charles. He watches you like he wants to eat you for dinner. Constance shivered at the thought. Well, he certainly watches me closely. He makes me nervous. He just wants to take you away from your life of toil and despair. Constance laughed. No, he wants me to move into his house and be his mistress. She hadn't meant to say the words, but they popped out of her mouth without her thinking about them. She still couldn't believe he'd asked her to be his mistress. Did she really seem like a woman with loose morals? Alice let out a squeal. You said yes, didn't you? Constance shook her head. My father would roll over in his grave if I became any man's mistress. My grandfather was a vicar, and I was raised to be a good Christian. Having that kind of relationship with a man without the benefit of marriage is not something I could do. Alice sat down on the bed beside Constance and took her hand. I really think you should. I know that seems crazy, but I've seen the way he looks at you. He's not just thinking of you as an object of his lust. He cares about you. We just met last night. He doesn't care about me. He's only interested in my favors. She stood and peered in the tiny mirror on the wall. I wish I could just not go. When he kisses me, I lose all my senses. She shouldn't have even thought about his kisses. Her lips started tingling again at the mere thought of his lips against hers. He kissed you? Alice's eyes were wide. Did you like his kisses? Johnny at the orphanage used to kiss me all the time, before he left to work in a coal mine. I liked it when he kissed me. Constance looked at the younger girl with surprise. You were kissing the other orphans? She couldn't believe the sweet 18-year-old orphan in front of her had more experience with the opposite sex than she did. Alice shrugged, her eyes full of mischief. Well, what else were we supposed to do on cold winter nights? Constance shook her head with a laugh. I think you're a lot naughtier than people know when they first meet you, Alice. Alice smiled. Of course, I am. It's what makes me so much fun. There was a knock on the door then, and Constance took a deep breath, her hand going to her flat stomach. She was wearing her best dress, but it was old and worn. Mrs. Jackson had promised they would make her a new church dress as soon as they had a lull in business, but business seemed to pick up a little more every day. She walked to the door and opened it, staring out at the man standing on her doorstep. He held a huge bouquet of flowers in his hand that he presented to her with a bow. "Your carriage awaits, milady." Constance couldn't help but laugh at his formal manners. "You're silly. I'm supposed to be curtsying to you. You shouldn't bow to me." She gave the bouquet to Alice as she took his arm. "Put those in water for me, please. I'll be home early." Charles called back over his shoulder, "Not if I can talk her into staying out late." He took her to the carriage and helped her up, taking the seat beside her instead of across from her. "Tomorrow's Sunday. You have the day off, don't you?" Constance nodded. "I do. That doesn't mean I'll be out until all hours, though." He obviously was trying to push her to stay with him, and she wasn't going to do it. She had morals even if he didn't. "Oh, of course not. You could stay at my house, though. There are so many bedrooms you could choose one, and I might not find you for days," he exaggerated. He didn't add that he'd search until she was found, with the help of all the servants if necessary. "I don't think that would be wise, but thank you for your offer." She fiddled with the gloves she wore, the gloves he'd sent her as a gift. "I'm not sure what you want from me." Charles put his arm around her shoulders and settled comfortably beside her. "Nothing you don't want to give. I promise." He buried his face in her hair as he spoke, obviously thrilled to have her beside him again. "I don't think this is a good idea. I should have stayed at home with Alice." He brushed his lips against her cheek. "This is a very good idea. We'll talk and get to know one another better." "You said your parents were gentry?" She nodded. "Yes, they were, and then I was with Lady Graves for 8 years. 8 very long years." She didn't tell him that, though. She'd been taught to never complain. Lady Graves had provided shelter and food for her belly. It hadn't always been champagne and roses, but very little in life was. "Did you enjoy your position with her?" Charles had his own opinions of the lady in question, but he didn't want to color her response. Constance thought hard before answering. "I was grateful to her for giving me a place to go after my parents' death. I don't know where I would have been otherwise. I had no family and nowhere to go." "That's not what I'm asking. What was it like to work for her?" Constance shrugged, again choosing her words carefully. "She was very set in her ways, but as long as I did what she wanted, and did it well, she was happy." She didn't add that she was never able to do things exactly the way the other woman wanted. If Constance took her hot chocolate in the mornings, Lady Graves wanted tea. If Constance took her tea, then Lady Graves had always wanted chocolate in the mornings. Nothing was ever good enough, but Constance had done her job without complaining. She was an old harridan. Charles's voice was filled with animosity as he made his declaration. Constance bit her lip to stifle her giggle. She wouldn't agree with him, because she felt too much loyalty to the old harridan, but she was thrilled deep down that others had seen her for what she was. "Don't speak ill of the dead," she chastised. He laughed. "Well, you won't, and someone has to." Her laughter erupted from her chest. "You're horrible." How could she laugh at something that was said with so much spite? So was she. She used to chase the children from the orphanage off her property. Everyone hated her. Charles may have been exaggerating a bit when he said everyone hated her, but most people in the area had not been fond of her. Constance sighed. "She gave me a home when no one else would. I will be forever grateful to her for that." He shook his head. "I'm sure you worked 20 times harder than anyone else she'd hired, so she was happy with you." He squeezed her hand. "You're a good woman, Constance." "I try to be." She thought about what Alice had said about how she should take him up on his offer, and she knew she couldn't. He thought she was a good woman. His opinion of her would change drastically if she became his mistress. They pulled up in front of his house, and he waited until the coachman put the steps down before he helped her down. "I'm glad you decided to accept my dinner invitation." Constance laughed. "You didn't really leave me with any choice." She was glad now that she was there, though. She wanted him to be with her every minute and was glad to have this special time with him. He smiled mischievously. I needed to get to know you. I've learned to get my way over the years. It must be nice being an Earl. He thought about that for a moment, even though she obviously hadn't meant it as a question. It can be. Lately I find myself wishing that I'd been born to a different family though, and had a different fate. He looked into her eyes as he told her that, making it clear that it was her he'd change his fate for. Why would you ever wish that? Constance couldn't understand what he would have to complain about when he'd been born into money and influence. If I had been born the butcher's son, you'd be planning our wedding today. I was born the son of an earl, though, so I don't get to marry the only woman I've ever met who has made me even think about spending my life with her. Instead, I have to go to town and look over the ladies on the marriage mart. What was it that Lily called them? He thought for a moment. Oh yes, the mass of marriage-minded misses. He took her hand and brought it to his lips. Today, I want to be Tom the baker's son. Would you pretend with me? We'll talk about how wonderful our lives will be as we plan how many children we'll have and what their names will be. Constance frowned. I can't pretend that, because when I go home, you'll still be an earl, and I'll still be the woman who works the front counter of the only seamstress in the village. She shook her head. Her heart would be broken, giving up the beautiful dream. No, she had to keep her feet firmly on the ground where they belonged. Charles put her hand in the curve of his arm and led her into the house. You can't pretend just for one night that we have a future ahead of us? That we're going to marry and have a huge number of little blonde babies. She smiled up at him. I'd rather they were dark like you. She hadn't meant to let those words escape her lips. She had to stop playing along with him. He led her to the dining room and pulled out the chair beside his. After he'd taken his seat, the soup was served, and she picked up her spoon for her first bite. Do you want children, my lord? Please call me Charles. At least for tonight, our one special night together, call me by my name. His voice practically begged her to agree. Of course, Charles. It was too important to him for her to agree. She would do anything to make him happy, anything but compromise her morals, of course. I do want children. I didn't before, but suddenly, all I can think about is having children. He took her hand in his. And making children, of course. I would be honored to make children with you. He brushed the palm of her hand with a kiss, sending a shiver down her spine. Constance blushed. If you were to make children with me, they would be bastards. You'd never marry me, so your children would never see the kind of wealth and privilege you expect in life. Why do you say that? He didn't understand her argument, but he was more than ready to hear her out and rebut it. He had to rebut it, because he needed her in his life. She sighed. I know that noblemen don't marry their mistresses. I may have been raised in the country, but I'm not ignorant. She almost wished she hadn't known better, because it would have made her happy for a time to be with him, but she couldn't do it. Constance, I'd marry you tomorrow if I could. She shrugged. You can't, though. I can see that as well as you can. She knew he could if he chose to, but what nobleman would choose to risk his reputation to marry a shop girl? Why would anyone do that? So move in with me. I won't marry anyone. It will be like we're married. I'll send my brother to represent me in Parliament, and we'll stay here in the country rusticating. We can have babies. They'll never know the difference. His voice was pleading as he made his case. He had to have her beside him, whether he understood why himself or not. She shook her head. I'll know the difference. I can't do that to my children. I can't do that to myself. She stared down at her soup, suddenly angry with the whole situation. I wasn't born into wealth. My family was poor. We always had food in our bellies, but we didn't have the kind of wealth you have. I've never expected to be the wife of a nobleman. It's not something I've ever aspired to. I look at you, though, and I see so many possibilities. I see a man I could be genuinely happy with, but who won't see me, because we're not of the same class. I'm just a toy to you. She wanted to be more though. She'd never wanted anything in her life as much as she wanted to be of noble birth at that moment. He threw down his napkin. A toy? You are a woman to me. A beautiful loving woman. I want to spend my life with you, but I don't have a choice. She shrugged. What's the good of being an Earl if you won't marry the person you want to marry? You can't make any real choices. It sounds to me like you're more limited in life than Johnny the baker's son, and that's really ridiculous. And deep down she knew he could make the choice if he wanted to. That's what upset her so much. He acted as if he had no choices in the world, but he did. He could marry her. He chose not to. Sometimes it is. He shook his head. I want to spend my life with you, Constance. I saw you and knew you were the woman meant for me. Please come live with me in my huge house. He'd never expected the world to be handed to him on a silver platter. He'd wanted so few things in life, and the one he wanted more than anything was out of reach. Why? I can't. Don't you understand? You say you care for me, for the person I am. Well, the person I am would be giving up everything she believes in if she moved in here as your mistress. I just can't do it. Charles nodded, obviously willing to admit defeat. Will you still have dinner with me? We can be friends? We can eat together once a week or so, keep up with each other. He knew he was asking for something that could never be, but he didn't want to lose her. If he never saw her, then he could never convince her to be his. Constance shook her head. I can't do that. Don't you see that when I look at you, all I can think about is what could be if you were just willing to go against what you believe? Or I was willing to go against what I believe. She met his eyes for the first time since they'd begun their conversation. My heart would break a little more every time I saw you. He sighed, pushing his soup away. At least we have tonight. I'll take what I can get. She smiled a wistful smile. Tonight is for us. They didn't talk about the future again as they ate their meal. Afterward, he took her into his parlor, and they chatted like old friends. She'd never felt an immediate affinity to someone she'd just met before, and it was odd how very close she felt to him right away. On the drive back to the village, she was silent, not wanting the night to end, and knowing he didn't either. What's your biggest fear? He asked as they drove up to the shop. What frightens you so much, you just don't think you could have a relationship with me? I don't want you to get out of this coach and leave my life forever. He had to make one last attempt to keep her. Something had to work. I couldn't have a child without being married. He'd be a child raised in two worlds. You say we'd have a home with you, but he'd never be able to inherit. He'd be used to living the life of the nobility, but never really fit in with others. How would that be all right? I don't know how to answer that. I can assure you that my family would treat him right, but I can make no promises for others. I guess we could just never leave the country. He knew she'd never agree, but he had to try. He couldn't let her get out of the coach without agreeing to see him again. She shook her head sadly. I couldn't do that, Charles. It wouldn't work out. Constance desperately hoped he'd ignore the problems, and just ask her to marry him. They were two people, standing among all the people of the world, with a true connection. How could he not see they belonged together? Charles put his arm around her shoulders and hugged her to him, his cheek resting atop her head. I don't want to let you go. She felt a tear trickle from the corner of her eye. You have to. You don't belong in my world, and I can't live in yours. Not in a way that would let me keep my pride. He cupped his face in her hands and lowered his lips to hers. The most wonderful woman he'd ever met, the woman he wanted to spend the rest of his life with, was about to step down out of his coach and leave his life forever. How could he let her do that? Constance felt the same desperation rushing through her that Charles did. She grasped the back of his head, winding her fingers through his hair, as she kissed him back, her tongue meeting his. She knew this was goodbye forever, and she couldn't bear to let him go. It was the only thing in the world that made sense, but she still couldn't bear it. He kissed her as if his life depended on it, and it felt like it did. He had seconds to convince her to take a chance. Please, come home with me. I can't let this be goodbye. She wrapped her arms tightly around him and hugged him close. You know where to find me if you ever decide you don't mind doing something to mess up your life forever like, oh, marry a woman with nothing. She kissed his cheek quickly and pulled away, climbing down the steps that had already been lowered and disappeared into her room. Charles watched the door close between them, and he wanted to scream at her to come back. He couldn't imagine life without her. Constance leaned back against the door and cried. She was in love for the first and only time in her life. He was an earl, and she was going to spend the rest of her life alone. She needed to get used to it. Chapter 5. Charles was true to his word and stopped sending gifts to the shop. Every day she'd hoped to see him, but she never did. Slowly everything returned to normal, and she became content with her work and life. Not happy, but content. She'd never expected anything more. One day in March, she looked up at the tinkling of the bell, and Charles was standing in front of her, hat in hand. "Lily sent me," he said in lieu of a greeting. "She did?" It wasn't what she wanted to hear, of course, but it was better than not seeing him at all. "Is she all right? Is the baby here yet?" He smiled, leaning against the counter. "You're always so concerned about others." He took her hand in his. "I've missed you." She bit her lip as she looked up at him, wondering how to respond to that. After a moment, she decided to be truthful. "I've missed you as well." He brought her fingers to his lips for a moment. "Lily wanted you to know that she had the babies." Constance's face split into a grin. "Babies? She had twins?" "She did. Both little red-headed girls. They're sure to be a handful. She wanted both you and Alice to know, and she asked me to give you this letter." He dug into his pocket and pulled out a letter that she opened. "Does she require an answer?" she asked. "She did ask me to wait for one. Dear Constance, I know you're probably surprised to hear from me, but I'm in desperate need of a good nurse for my daughters. I'd like someone who would be able to teach them as they grow older, so I think you would be a good choice. I know you've been a lady's companion, so if you like children, you would certainly be qualified. I'd need someone as soon as possible, because having 2 babies is so much more than I bargained for. I thought I would be able to care for them myself, but it's been a week, and I assure you, I'm getting no better at this. Please, send an answer back with Charles. Whatever you're being paid, I'll double it. You'd have room and board of course. And we'd work out a day off. Please say yes. Begging for your help, Lily." Constance read over the letter once more and thought about the words. She liked the idea of being a nurse and then later a governess as the girls got older, but she wasn't sure if seeing Charles more regularly was a good thing. Would she be able to stand seeing him with his family, and not desperately wanting to be a part of that family? After a moment, she nodded. "I'll do it. I need to give notice here, of course. I can't just leave Mrs. Jackson without a front desk girl." "No, of course you can't." He liked that she had ethics. That she cared about doing the right thing. "Let me go talk to her now, and see how long she thinks she needs to find someone." "Just a moment." Constance hurried into the back of the store, smiling at Alice first. "There's some good news for you." Alice stood, carefully folded the dress she was hemming, and walked to the front of the store while Constance turned to Mrs. Jackson. "I need to talk to you for a moment privately," she said. Mrs. Jackson stood and walked to the storage room where the fabric was kept. "You're quitting?" Constance nodded. "Lady Lily has offered me a position as a nurse and later a governess. It's the job I've wanted for years." "I'm so sorry. I'm very grateful that you've given me this opportunity." "How much notice are you giving me?" Constance shrugged. "I've never given notice before." "How much do you need?" Mrs. Jackson frowned. "Lady Lily needs you as soon as possible, I'm assuming?" "Yes, she does. She just had twins." "Oh, twins. I had twins." "They're both married now." Mrs. Jackson shook her head. "She needs you more than I do. I'll tell you what. Spend the rest of the day training Alice to work the front while she sews, and you can go over after work today. Lady Lily has done so much for this village that I just can't begrudge her anything." Constance shook her head. No, I can't do that to you. It's fine. Alice is a fast learner, and her accent is good. She'll do well. Constance took the older woman's hand in hers. Thank you so much. She rushed to the front. Tell her I can come this evening. Would you ask her to send a coach? Or should I just walk? A coach will be here for you at 6? Does that give you enough time to get ready? I think so. Constance turned to Alice. You're to work up front from now on. I'll teach you this afternoon. Alice nodded. I'm excited for you, but I'm going to miss you. More than I can say. Constance smiled at her friend. We'll keep in touch. I'll have days off, you know. Charles walked toward the door. I promised Lily I'd bring your answer back as soon as I had one. She'll be ecstatic. He nodded toward them before rushing out the door. The afternoon felt rushed as she tried to teach Alice everything she needed to know before the end of the day. Do you like the idea of taking care of someone else's baby? Alice asked. I spent so many years in the orphanage helping with the younger children that I have no desire to ever do it again. Constance grinned at her friend. Well, that answers that question. What question? I was worried you'd be upset, she asked me, and not you. Constance straightened the counter at the front of the store, getting ready to leave for the last time. I'm going to miss this place. It was the first place I was content since my parents died. Alice gave her a surprised look. She'd never spoken about Lady Graves because she refused to speak ill of the dead. She felt too much loyalty for the crotchety old woman. You weren't happy with Lady Graves? Constance shrugged. It was a difficult position. She wasn't willing to say more. Alice helped her pack her things. She had 2 new dresses to show for her time working in the shop, but other than that, she was leaving with all the same things she'd come with. I'm going to miss my friend. I'll miss you too. So much. I'll come visit you as soon as I can. She hugged the younger girl tightly. And you can come out and visit soon. I know you want to see the babies as much as I do. Alice smiled through her tears. I do want to see the babies. Lady Lily won't mind if I visit. Constance had just closed her bag when there was a knock on the door. That must be Lady Lily's coachman. She looked at Alice again. We'll see each other very soon. Alice nodded dejectedly, looking around the tiny room. I'm sure Mrs. Jackson will hire someone else to take your place, but it just won't be the same. Constance opened the door with her bag in her hand. Lord Charles. He smiled and tipped his hat to her. Are you ready? Yes, but I thought Lady Lily would send a coach. She wasn't sure why he was there, but her heart jumped at the sight of him. I volunteered. Lily is so frazzled with the twins that she had no idea what to do. Well, thank you for driving me to her house. He took her bag from her, and she looked back at Alice one last time. I'll see you soon. I promise. Alice stood in the doorway watching as Lord Charles helped Constance into his coach. Constance waved one last time as the coachman closed the door, and climbed to his box. I've missed you, Charles said simply. Constance looked at him and found herself lost in his dark eyes. I've missed you, she responded, wishing she knew how to deal with this man. The coach had just started moving when he moved across to take a seat beside her, putting his arm around her shoulders. She immediately shook her head. I can't kiss you. You're my employer's brother. It wouldn't be ethical. I don't care if it's ethical or not. He cupped his face in her hands and lowered his mouth to hers. She tried to resist for a moment, refusing to kiss him back, but she couldn't help herself for long. Soon her mouth opened, and her tongue stroked against his. She wrapped her arms around his neck and held on for dear life. Oh, Charles, she whispered. Is that an oh, Charles, take me to your home and let me spend the rest of my life loving you? He kissed a trail of kisses across her cheek and down to her neck where he nipped at her skin. Constance shuddered as the passion rushed through her body. How could she possibly have this man in such close proximity without going insane? She knew what she felt for him was wrong, but she couldn't stop it. She cared for him too much. She'd always been a down-to-earth woman, not believing in things like soulmates and love at first sight. Charles had changed all that. "I need you," he whispered. "Please forget about the position and come live with me. I promise to make you the happiest woman alive." She pulled back, shaking her head sadly. "Even I know a mistress doesn't live with her protector." "You would. You'd be not only my mistress, but my life. Until it was time for you to produce an heir and your wife kicked me out on my backside." Wives don't take kindly to their husbands' mistresses living under their roof and having his children around. He sighed, burying his face in her hair. His father had been rigid about rules of propriety. He couldn't imagine not doing his duty by his name and marrying Constance, but he couldn't imagine not having an heir either. He knew she was right, but he so desperately wanted her in his life. Would it really be so wrong? "I'm sorry." She nodded. "Me too." There was nothing else to say. They both desperately wanted to be together, but neither could do it. He helped her down from the coach in front of Lily's house and carried her bag in for her. Lily was in the downstairs parlor with both babies, looking tired and worn. Constance rushed to her, taking one of the babies from her arms. "Why weren't the maids helping?" "I wouldn't let them." "What do maids know about taking care of my babies?" Constance laughed softly. "You assume I know how to take care of your babies, like it's something that just comes naturally." Lily's eyes met hers. "I think you're the perfect woman for the position." She looked back and forth between her brother and her new nurse and smiled serenely. Constance looked at the baby in her arms. "Who am I holding?" Lily looked up. "That one's Mabel." "I'm holding Millicent." She sighed. "They seem to cry a lot." Constance sat down on the sofa beside her new employer. "Babies tend to do that." She looked between the two. "Are they identical?" Lily shook her head. "No, look, their noses are just a little bit different. Mabel's nose turns up just the tiniest bit at the end and Millicent's doesn't." Constance smiled and nodded. "Good, I'll be able to tell them apart then." Charles watched the two women for a moment before clearing his throat. "Looks like I just became unnecessary." He liked looking at Constance with his tiny niece. He desperately wanted to see her with his child. "I need to get home." Lily looked up at him. "Oh, won't you stay for supper?" He shook his head, unwilling to stay for a supper he knew Constance wouldn't be eating with the family. She was a servant here. "I need to go." "Thank you for bringing Constance to us." Lily smiled, her eyes tired but happy. "Would you join Constance and I for tea tomorrow?" He nodded, happy to think that she'd be having tea with the family. "I'd love that." Constance smiled, because she was thrilled for the opportunity to see him. She knew it was better for her when she didn't, but she couldn't seem to convince her heart of that. "Come around 2 then," Lily told him. "Hopefully we can have the twins napping then, so we're not fighting them as we eat our biscuits." "I'll be here," Charles told them both. "Thank you for bringing me, Lord Charles." Constance looked up at him as she said the words. She was struck again by his beautiful brown eyes. She wished there were some way to make things work out between them. After he'd left, Lily turned to her. "It's not impossible, you know." Constance frowned. "What's not impossible?" "A marriage between you and Charles." Lily watched the other woman closely as she said the words. Constance shook her head. "I don't know what you're talking about." Lily laughed. "I'd have to be blind not to see the looks that keep passing between you and my brother." "Don't worry. We'll figure it out." She cooed down at the baby in her arms for a moment. "You both deserve happiness." Constance was mortified that her emotions showed so clearly when Charles was around. "I can't be his mistress." "Of course, you can't. He would never even ask it." Constance said nothing as she stared down at the baby in her arms. She wasn't going to try to disillusion Lily about her brother. He didn't. Lily sounded truly scandalized. He hit Kit, repeatedly, when I got pregnant before marriage, and he thinks it's perfectly fine to have a mistress? Especially a mistress he cares so much about? What is wrong with that man? Constance blushed. Please don't say anything to him. He won't marry me, because everyone would be scandalized. It's fine. I understand. He lives in the country. No one will be scandalized. It would be harder if he were part of the London social scene, but he's not. He never has been. He prefers his quiet time in the country, so he could marry you and no one would say a word. Lily shook her head. You were raised country gentry, weren't you? Constance nodded. I was, but my family wasn't wealthy. If I were an heiress it would be one thing, but I'm not. I'm just from a poor country family with no title. Lily shrugged. That doesn't matter to me. I'd be willing to bet it doesn't matter to our brother, James. What difference does all that make? It makes a difference to most people. Lily shook her head. Charles has always been extremely open-minded. My father wouldn't let me marry Kit because he was a third son. Charles would have told me to marry for love. He's told me we can't marry. That he'd be happy to have me for his mistress, but not his wife. He wants me to live in his house with him. Lily sighed heavily. You are going to be my sister-in-law, just wait. She stood with the baby in her arms. For now, though, you're going to be my savior. Let's get these babies upstairs to bed, and then I'll show you your room. Constance stood, holding the baby carefully against her. She hadn't spent a great deal of time around young children being an only child, but she had always enjoyed them. She followed Lily upstairs and to the nursery. Both babies were put into their beds, and they quietly tiptoed out of the room. Once they were in the hall, Lily put her hand through Constance's arm. My best friend is my maid, Bernice. She whispered the words as if she were sharing a huge secret with Constance. Constance laughed. So you like the idea of your brother marrying your nurse? It doesn't bother me at all. I was raised in the country, just like my brother was. Class distinctions just aren't as important here. She opened a door that was next to the nursery. This is your room. Constance looked around the room. It was simply furnished with a small bed and a dresser with a mirror over it. There was a wardrobe off to one side to hang her clothes in. It was nicer than any room she'd had since her parents had died. It's perfect. Thank you. Lily smiled. If you want to make any changes, do so. We'll have dinner in about 30 minutes, so go ahead and get dressed if you want to change. You're fine the way you are, though. Constance looked at the other woman in surprise. You want me to have dinner with the family? She knew things weren't done that way. Lily shrugged. We don't stand on ceremony here. Besides, I'm not going to tell my future sister-in-law she has to eat with the servants. She closed the door behind her as she left the room, obviously pleased with her parting remark. Constance sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, thinking about what Lily had said. She really thought Charles would marry her? He certainly didn't seem to think it was a good idea. Instead of leaving right away, Charles sought out Kit. He liked the other man, despite having to protect his sister's honor with his fists, when he'd first discovered he was the man to have ruined Lily. He knocked on the other man's study, standing outside the door waiting. Enter. Charles opened the door and walked inside. Do you have a few minutes? Kit looked at him warily. That depends. Are you going to hit me or talk to me? Charles smiled. I'm done hitting you. I did what I had to do for my sister. Oh, I know that, but I still see you and want to rub my eye. He waved to the seat across from his huge oak desk. What can I do for you? Charles wasn't sure how to say what he needed to say, so he just blurted it right out. I'm in love with your nurse. Kit frowned. My nurse? Oh. Constance. Is she here now? He started to stand to go and see if Lily was pleased. Yes, I'm in love with Constance. Aren't you shocked? Kit looked at his brother-in-law and realized that right at that moment, he needed him more than Lily did. No, I'm not shocked. I saw how you were looking at her at dinner the other night. Charles sighed. I didn't realize I was so obvious. Kit laughed softly. No man has ever been more obvious. Well, except me with Lily maybe. I can't marry her. She's a servant. She was raised country gentry. It's not a match that London matrons would approve of certainly, but you live in the country. Your whole life is here except for when you're in town for Parliament. You can leave her at home then or take her with you. No one will mind either way. Kit shrugged. That obstacle is only in your mind. Charles leaned back in his chair. And my father's. Your father was a judgmental ass. Kit shook his head. If it had been up to him, Lily would never have married me. She'd have been forced to marry the man with the highest title who offered for her, and her feelings would have been ignored. It's the way of society. It may be, but I can tell you, marrying for love is so much better than pleasing others. I can't imagine my life with anyone but your sister. She's the only woman I've ever cared for this way. Kit shrugged. I guess you need to decide if love is more important to you than how society will see things. I think it is. Charles struggled with the thought for a moment. You and Lily wouldn't stop seeing us if I married her? Kit laughed. Why would we do that? We've been in your position. She was too far above me to marry, at least your father thought so. He paused, staring at the wall behind Charles for a moment. To me, being with the only woman in the world God meant for just me is so much more important than anything else. Don't give up on your love for her. Charles nodded briskly. I'll try not to. Lily invited me for tea tomorrow. I'm so glad that she's willing to treat Constance as a member of the family and have tea with her. Kit laughed. She'll be having dinner with us every night as well. Lily told me that her future sister-in-law will not be eating with the servants. Charles stared at Kit. Are you serious? She said that? I couldn't make that up. No, you couldn't. Lily invited me to dinner, but I said no, because I assumed she'd be eating with the servants. Invite me? Kit grinned. We'd be happy to have you join us for dinner, Charles. I'd be delighted, Kit. With both of you asking me, it's just forced me into accepting. Charles smiled, happy to consider the idea of marrying Constance. If his sister and brother-in-law approved so heartily, did the rest of the world matter? He was an earl, for God's sake. If he couldn't break some rules, what was the point? Constance rushed into the parlor before dinner, expecting to see just Kit and Lily. She felt a little bit uncomfortable eating with them, but she was thrilled to be asked. She stopped short when she saw Charles standing before the fireplace, watching her. She gave a quick curtsy. Lord Charles. He shook his head, nodding to the sofa where Kit and Lily were sitting, talking in low tones. They both expect us to marry. Call me Charles. She shook her head. You don't want to marry me. Oh, you're wrong about that, Constance. There's nothing I want as much as I want to marry you. I've just seen it as impossible. I still need to do some thinking on it, but I believe I may have been incorrect. She took a step closer to him, close enough that she could speak in soft tones that wouldn't be heard from the sofa. Are you serious? You're reconsidering? Her heart jumped. It wasn't that she wanted to be married to an earl. That meant nothing to her. Being married to Charles, however, meant the world to her. He nodded once. I've been assured that it doesn't matter who I marry, because we live in the country and aren't active in the London social scene. He reached out and stroked her cheek with the back of his hand. I don't want to live my life without you. Constance smiled brightly. Let me know when you've made a decision. She winked at him. I'll try to still be available then. He laughed and caught her arm, pulling her toward him. She pulled back, nodding toward the sofa. Not in front of my employers. Just think of them as future in-laws. That's how they think of you. She frowned. Not until you think of me as your future wife. The butler arrived then, to let them know dinner was ready. Kit and Lily led the way, Lily holding her husband's arm and speaking to him in low tones. Charles held his arm out for Constance, and she took it, worried that she was making a big mistake by allowing him to act as if he was courting her, before any real decision had been made. He held her chair and she sat beside him. Lily was across from her and Lord Kit was to her right at the head of the table. "Will you walk with me after dinner?" Charles asked, his lips against her ear. Constance looked to see if anyone had heard his question and finally nodded. Yes, I'd like that. She would be certain that nothing happened between them, but she would love to walk with him. Not another word of private conversation was exchanged between them until after the meal. When they were finished eating, he got to his feet. "I'm going to borrow your nurse for a walk, Lily." Lily nodded with a smile. Constance held back. "Do you need me for anything before I go?" "The babies should sleep for another hour or two before they stay up all night." Lily yawned. "I'm going to go catch a bit of sleep before the all-night feeding and pacing ritual begins." Constance smiled. "We're in for a long night, are we?" Lily nodded. "I have to be the one to feed them, of course, but I'll need your help with the pacing. You'll have some time to sleep tomorrow, and we'll catch catnaps when we can." "You should have contacted me sooner," Constance protested. Lily smiled. "I wanted a bit of time alone with my new daughters. I had to tell them about the evilness of shoes and the pure joy involved in tree climbing." Constance smiled while the two men laughed. "I hope they listened well, because every nice day, those babies will be taking nice long walks in their pram." "Yes, they will." Lily smiled. "You can't keep a child indoors. It ruins their spirit." Constance left with Charles, and as soon as they were outside, he caught her hand in his, holding it as he walked away from the house. "I hope you understand that nothing can happen between us while we walk," Constance began. Charles shook his head. "Nothing will happen that you don't want to happen. We can just talk or find a place where I can kiss you senseless." She laughed. "Why am I always the one who ends up senseless when we kiss? How about I kiss you senseless? That sounds like a very worthy goal." He grinned down at her, walking toward the lake. "I love to walk around the lake at night. Do you mind?" He wondered about the fountain he'd seen just a week before down by the lake. Would it still be there? He'd only ever seen it the one time. Why would someone take a fountain there? Sure enough, they walked straight to it. Constance smiled when she saw it. "I love this fountain. It's beautiful." "You've seen it before?" he asked with surprise. "Yes, of course. It was here the day I walked into town to start my new position at the seamstress shop." He looked down at it with surprise. "I saw it for the first time just a week ago. I was out here at night, just wandering around, missing you." He grinned down at her. "Do you want to hear something funny?" She looked at him. "Of course. I love to laugh as much as the next girl. I made a wish on the fountain." She smiled. She didn't mention she'd done the same. "You did? What did you wish for?" "A way to marry you." "I hope you found it." She could think of nothing she wanted more than marriage to him. If she found out that he decided he couldn't marry her because of her lack of lineage, she'd be sorely disappointed at this point. He caught her waist and pulled her into his arms. "Now would be a good time to try to kiss me senseless." She giggled softly. "I don't know about that. Maybe I can kiss you senseless to seal our engagement." "You could at least start practicing now," he told her. He lowered his head and caught her lips with his tongue stroking inside her mouth to tangle with hers. Constance stood on her tiptoes to get closer to him, wrapping her arms around his neck and holding him tight. How could she feel more for this man every time she touched him? If she felt much more, she knew she'd explode. He gathered her close and stroked her back through the dress she wore. She'd been cold before his touch and now felt as if she were going to be burned alive. His hands were better than any fire she'd ever stood before. She didn't know how long they kissed before she finally pulled away. "I need to get back to the house. I need to get a little sleep before the babies start waking." He nodded, dipping his head to kiss her one last time. I'll be here for tea tomorrow, he reminded her as they walked back toward the house. She rested her head against his shoulder. I can't wait. Once they reached the house, he kissed her softly one last time before opening the front door for her. Tomorrow. She smiled, practically floating up the stairs. Tomorrow she would see her love. She only hoped he was able to make his decision quickly. Chapter 6. The night was long as Lily had said it would be. She would pace with one baby while Lily fed or paced with the other. She got a grand total of 4 hours of sleep before the sun came up. They put both babies down at the same time again at 6, and Lily let out a tired groan. Let's get some sleep. They'll sleep for a few hours now. Constance looked at Lily. We have got to get them on a nighttime sleep schedule. Lily nodded. This would have been fine in London when the parties last until all hours, but we're in the country. I barely see my husband right now. She walked toward the door. Sleep. I've got Bernice watching for them. She'll let us know if one of us is needed. Constance nodded, going to her own room. I'll see you soon then. She was more tired than she ever remembered being. Of course, she'd worked all day and then worked all night as well, so it made sense she was tired. She climbed into her bed, and her last thought was of Charles smiling at her. She hoped he made the right choice for them both. Tea that afternoon was lovely. Charles and Kit were both there, but Charles made no move to see Constance alone. When he first arrived, his face was hidden behind a dozen roses, which he handed to Constance. Her face showed her pleasure. He was the only man who had ever brought her flowers. Thank you. They're beautiful. Just like you. He sat beside her on the sofa, not touching her, but giving her looks that told her he wished they could be alone together. After tea, he asked, "What is your day off going to be?" Constance looked at him for a moment. We haven't discussed that yet. We've been too busy with babies. She looked at Lily. What day did you have off when you worked at the seamstress? Lily asked. Just Sundays. We had a 6-day work week. She would be happy to work that again if that's what Lily needed from her. Lily seemed to think about it. How about we give you Wednesday afternoons as well? That will make it so you have time to rest up from the endless hours of sleeplessness. Constance smiled. Will you be able to cope? Lily nodded. Oh yes, I'm going to take an afternoon off as well. I'll feed both girls and then go do whatever I want. She considered for a moment. I believe I'll take Mondays. I'll need it after you have a full day off on Sundays. Constance smiled. Yes, you probably will. We did really well working together last night, though. I'm glad you've joined me here. I am too. She turned to Charles. I have Sundays and Wednesday afternoons. He thought for a moment. Could I steal you after church on Sunday? Just for a few hours? Lily frowned. Where do you plan to take her, Charles? Just for a drive. I want to talk to her without screaming babies interrupting. Constance stifled a laugh at Lily's glare. Those screaming babies happen to be your nieces. And they're beautiful girls. He stood up. Today's Friday, so I'll be by for you on Sunday. I'll bring a picnic, so don't eat. Constance nodded. I'll be ready for you. After he was gone, Kit left to go to his study, and Constance was left alone with Lily. Constance was surprised by just how many hours the babies slept during the day when they were up all night every night. Thank you for giving me time with him. Lily nodded. Just be careful. I love my brother, but I don't want to see you hurt. Constance was surprised. Why would I be hurt? He's working through his feelings about marrying you. I can see it. Father pounded into his head that he couldn't marry anyone who was not the daughter of a titled gentleman. Father was interesting and hard on all of us in different ways. I see. I think he's softening. Lily nodded. I could see that. He's starting to court you. I like it. Of course you do. Lily stood and stretched. I'm tired. I'm going to get another quick nap while the babies are sleeping. I know it's silly, because it seems like I've slept all day, but I'm still so tired. You just had 2 babies. Of course, you're tired. Frankly, I am too. I'll open the door between my room and the nursery, and I'll nap as well. I don't think we're going to get much but sleeping done until the girls are a little older. Constance stood and the 2 women walked toward the stairs together. I want to thank you again for dropping everything and coming to work for me. I needed you. It's my pleasure. I always knew that I wanted to either be a nurse or a governess. I'll get to do both here, and I love that idea. If you had your preference, which would you choose? Oh, governess most definitely. I love walking and exploring. I could combine my favorite thing with my work. It would be glorious. Constance went into her bedroom and stood in the doorway. I'll listen for the babies and get you if I need to. Go to sleep. Lily nodded, her eyes drooping. Constance was pleased to note that she did look better than she had the previous evening. Having help agreed with her. By Sunday afternoon, Constance was nervous about her drive with Charles. He'd sent small gifts to her every day that week. One day, it was chocolates. The next he'd sent flowers. She loved that he sent small things, but reminded her he was thinking about her every day. She dressed in the dress she'd just had made before leaving her job in the village and carefully fixed her hair. When she was ready, she waited in the downstairs parlor with her hands folded on her lap to keep her from twisting her skirt. Lily came in and found her there, sitting beside her. You look nervous. Constance nodded. I am. I'm not sure what he wants to talk to me about. Is he going to tell me that he just can't see marrying me, or is he going to say that he's decided we should marry? I just have no idea, so I'm sitting here trying to calm my thoughts. Lily smiled, squeezing her hand. He'll do the right thing. He's a good man, Constance. I don't say that lightly. She frowned thinking back. When my father first died, I wanted to go to the continent myself and find Kit and drag him back here to marry me. I knew my father had lied to both of us. Charles made me agree to try to find a husband in London, but I got to say no. I said no to them all. Really? He let you make the decision? Lily nodded. My father would have forced me to marry the first man with a title. Charles is a good man. I'm worried that with as hard as father was on him, though, that he'll have a hard time realizing it's all right to marry someone father wouldn't have approved of. Constance looked down at her hands. I hate the idea that your father wouldn't have approved of me. What about your mother? Lily shrugged. She died when I was born. I thought for years that I'd killed her. Everyone says that I'm just like her, so I know that she'd have chosen my life over her own. I'd certainly have chosen Mabel and Millicent over my own life. Do you think she'd have approved of me? I think she'd have approved of any woman who would make Charles happy. You will make Charles very happy. Constance let out a sigh of relief. She wasn't sure she could have said yes, without knowing at least one of his parents would have approved of her. Thank you for being so supportive of my relationship with your brother. Most women would frown on their children's nurse marrying their brother. I've never been like most women. Lily looked up at a cleared throat. Lord Charles is here for Miss Constance. The butler seemed to disapprove, but Constance didn't need his opinion. She was happy with Lily's. Thank you. Constance got to her feet and walked toward the front door, pleased that he'd arrived on time. She forced herself to walk slowly and remain calm. Her whole life was hanging in the balance, and it was hard for her. Charles was waiting outside the door and smiled when he saw her. I brought the phaeton. I hope that's all right? Constance looked at the fast buggy and nodded. I've seen them but never ridden in one. They're fast, he told her with a smile. He carefully helped her up onto the seat and moved around to climb up beside her. Cook made fried chicken for lunch. Do you like fried chicken? Constance smiled and nodded. She hadn't had fried chicken since she was a child, but she'd always loved it. I'd like that. He didn't say much as he drove, and she worried that he had decided they wouldn't suit or that he didn't want to marry her. Finally, he stopped beside the lake, but on the opposite side from the fountain. He helped her down, and the two of them spread a blanket on the ground for their picnic. Once they were seated, Constance dug into the picnic basket and spread food out for the two of them. He waited until she had everything spread out just right before taking her hand in his. "I've done a lot of thinking over the past few days. I talked to Kit about the possibility of marrying you. Lily has made it clear she wants to see us marry. I've weighed all the different options, and I've decided that the whole thing boils down to one thing and one thing only." Constance watched his face as he spoke, but he gave nothing away. "What's that?" "I want to marry you. I can't imagine being married or spending my life with anyone else." He shrugged. "You complete me." Constance felt a slow tear roll down her cheek at his words. "I feel the same way." He took her hand and brought it to his lips. "Constance Smythe, will you marry me, and make me the happiest man alive?" Constance nodded once. "Oh, yes." She flung herself into his arms and held tight to him. "I can't imagine marrying anyone else." Charles just held her for a moment, his hand stroking up and down her back. "It takes 3 weeks unless I get a special license. My sister is going to need at least 3 weeks to find a good nurse, so we'll marry 3 weeks from today, if you are all right with that." "On a Sunday?" she asked. "Weren't marriages always held on Saturdays?" He shrugged. "I'm bucking tradition in every other way. I can buck tradition with the day I marry as well." She sighed happily, her face buried in his shoulder. 3 weeks from today sounds perfect." She pulled away, the fear showing on her face. "Do you want a big wedding?" "Absolutely not. We'll do something small with just family." He could see that she didn't want to be introduced to society with a huge wedding. How could he blame her? "May I invite Alice?" "You may invite anyone you'd like," he told her. "I don't care who is there as long as you leave the church as my wife." She smiled happily. "That's all I want as well." Chapter 7. The time leading up to their wedding went quickly. Constance found she spent all her time with Lily, either planning the wedding or helping with the babies. Lily had always treated Constance as an equal, so nothing changed there, but the other servants in Lily's big house changed how they treated her dramatically. Mrs. Jackson and the other women in the seamstress shop worked to make her the most spectacular gown she could have imagined, and Lily paid for it with a smile. "I can't let you pay for my wedding gown." Lily shook her head. "I didn't get a pretty wedding gown, because I didn't know I was getting married. I get to choose and pay for one in my life." Constance frowned. "You don't think you'll choose and pay for your daughter's gowns?" "Not in this decade I won't." Lily wasn't taking any kind of argument from her new friend. One of the older girls from the orphanage had taken on the job of nurse for the twins, and Constance was thrilled that she was going to work out. She didn't bother to ask why Lily hadn't just asked and to do the job to begin with, because she knew the answer. Lily had wanted to throw Charles and Constance together as much as possible. Charles stopped by the day before the wedding and took Constance for a short walk. "Is everything ready?" he asked. She nodded. "It's been hard to make all the preparations, but I think we're finally finished." He slipped his arm around her waist as they walked, pulling her up against him. "I can't wait." She looked up at him. "You're that ready to be married?" "I'm that ready to be married to you." He walked to a small gazebo, hidden from the house by a small copse of oak trees. He walked in and sat down, pulling her down beside him. She immediately went into his arms, raising her lips for his kiss. They hadn't had time to see a great deal of one another during their short engagement, but their time together had become more and more passionate. Her arms wrapped around his back and she held him close, her hands moving under his jacket so she could touch him through the fine linen of his shirt. His tongue moved into her mouth to tangle with hers, while his hands pulled her even closer against him. "I need you," he whispered against her lips. She let out a low moan as his hand cupped her breast through her gown. It was the first time he'd been bold enough to touch her there, and she liked it more than she cared to admit. "Tomorrow night," she whispered. He groaned. I don't want to wait any longer. She pulled back and looked into his eyes. It's only one more night. Our wedding night should be special. He dropped his forehead against hers. If you were any other woman in the world, I'd be pushing you, but I know you feel as strongly as I do. Tomorrow night there had better not be any arguments. He was more than a little frustrated, having slept in his lonely bed dreaming of their wedding night for the past 3 weeks. She sighed. I do want you, Charles. Every time she touched him, her body came alive. She loved being with him, and she wasn't going to hide it. I guess I can wait another 36 hours, he growled. She giggled. You wouldn't have really made love to me for the first time in your sister's gazebo. You know, sometimes I think you know me better than any person ever has. At times like this, I know you don't, though. I would take you anywhere at this point. I wouldn't care if we were in a church. She nipped at his chin, using her teeth against his skin. I'd want to let you. He stood, gripping her hands and pulling her to her feet. Where are we going? She asked as he strode in the opposite direction from his sister's house. I'm going to find a church. The laughter bubbled up out of her throat, and she realized she'd laughed more since she met this man than she had in the years since her parents died. She'd almost forgotten how good it felt to laugh. You're silly. Get me back to Lily's before dinner, she said. He grabbed her by her waist and spun her in a circle. You're really going to make me wait, aren't you? Of course, I am. Constance shook her head at him for expecting anything else from her. He caught her to him, giving her one last desperately hungry kiss. I can wait until tomorrow. Just barely. The walk back to his sister's house was made in silence. She felt like she was doing something wrong by not giving in, but she desperately wanted to remember her wedding night as a special time with him. He kissed her quickly and left with a wave. I'll see you at the church. Constance leaned against the wall on the front of the house for a moment. I'll be there. Constance sat at the dressing table in Marsgate Manor, brushing her hair. Charles had very reluctantly agreed to give her 5 minutes alone to dress for bed, and she was doing her best to hurry. Lily had given her a wedding gift just that morning that she'd whispered to Constance was for the wedding night. Constance had just opened it and found a beautiful pale blue nightgown, cut very low in the front with a slit in the side that went all the way up her thigh. She'd blushed when she saw it, but she'd put it on, recognizing that Charles would love it. She finished brushing her hair, and put the brush down with trembling hands. She wanted Charles, but she was still nervous. What would it be like to do that with him? Lily had talked to her about what would occur, and she had assured her that it would be wonderful. When you love a man, you enjoy his attentions in bed. Constance had been a little embarrassed to talk about it, but Lily had been so open, she'd asked several questions. Now the time was at hand, and she wished she'd asked dozens more. Was she supposed to wait for him under the covers, or should she wait at her dressing table? Or should she wait standing in front of the window? She had no idea what the right thing to do was, and she wanted to please her husband. How could she please him? Charles knocked once briefly on the door and opened it wide, his eyes scanning the room for his wife. Wife. He loved that word as it related to Constance. No one had seemed shocked about him marrying her. They'd all acted as if it were normal for an earl to marry a girl from a dress shop. She had yet to be introduced to society, but he had no worries there. He didn't spend enough time in London for anyone's opinions to matter. Finally, he spotted her next to the open window. She was wearing a nightgown with nothing over it, and his heart skipped a beat. She was more beautiful than he'd ever seen her, standing quietly waiting for him to join her. He strode quickly across the room to her. He hadn't undressed, because she was in his room. The room usually given to the Countess was right next door, but he didn't even want her to know there was an option of not sharing his bed all night every night. He wanted to hold her against him and make love to her every chance he got. She was his wife. Wives were meant to be close. He doubted she'd ever realize that she was meant to have a room separate from his. He walked to her slowly, savoring the moment. He was certain Lily must have helped his sweet bride find her nightgown, because he knew Constance would have covered herself from head to toe given the chance. He knew she was willing, but she was so nervous about the whole thing, he knew there would have to be a great deal of coaxing involved. As he stepped to within arm's distance of her, he simply looked at her, drinking in his fill. "You're beautiful," he whispered. She smiled nervously. "Thank you." He reached out and stroked his hand down her arm, not making any other moves, but getting her used to his touch against her bare skin. She'd felt his hands through her dress many times, but never against her bare skin. "The wedding was nice. You and Lily did a good job planning it," she swallowed hard, looking up at him. When he did nothing but continue to stroke her arm, she took the 2 steps that brought her flush up against him, wrapping her arms tightly around him. "I'm glad you're my husband now." He smiled, holding her by her shoulders and looking down at her. "Not as happy as I am." He kissed her quickly, pressing a small trail of kisses from her lips across to her neck and down her shoulder. "I love touching your skin. It's so soft." She moved her hands over his back. "You know, you didn't have to come to me in your suit, even I know the clothes have to come off for this." He chuckled. "Well, look who's eager now." She blushed. "I am eager. We married, and it's perfectly acceptable. It's my duty even." His nose wrinkled at the term duty. "Your duty?" He held her by the shoulders and looked down into her eyes. "Is that how you see this?" "Not at all. I know a lot of women do, though. I see this as making love with my husband, something I've been waiting to do since the day I met him." She kissed his chin. "Since I first saw him galloping across the countryside years ago." "Galloping across the countryside? You mean over near the stream?" He stared at her with surprise. He'd always assumed orphans had watched him there, but instead it had been his little wife. "I always knew someone was watching me when I rode there." "You didn't seem to. You never slowed down or stopped." She helped him take his jacket off his shoulders. "I used to sit by that stream and watch you ride. It made my time with Lady Graves so much more bearable." He stroked her hair, which he was seeing down for the first time. It was past her waist, and he couldn't help but be intrigued by it. "Why didn't you tell me before that was you? I didn't know you'd even realized anyone was there." She slowly unbuttoned his shirt while they talked. He seemed not to realize that she was methodically removing all his clothing, and she was thankful for that. Once it was unbuttoned, she untucked it from his pants. He stepped back and kicked off his shoes, before moving to sit on the side of the bed, pulling her toward him to stand between his spread thighs. He pressed his face against her silk-covered breasts, and she moaned softly in surprise. He moved his hands around to her bottom, and pulled her more toward him, his hands starting a slow exploration of everything they could reach. She took a step back and pulled the nightgown over her head, dropping it to the floor. She knew he hadn't expected her to do anything nearly so brazen, so she was quite proud of herself when she finished. He stood and unfastened the buttons on the front of his trousers before dropping them to the floor, leaving them to face each other in their nudity. Constance did her best not to blush, and she refused to look below his shoulders. She'd seen a naked baby once, but she'd never seen a grown man naked, and she wasn't about to start now. She stepped toward him again, pressing herself up against his nakedness, surprised at how good it felt to feel him against her. Charles took deep gulping breaths, to try to calm his raging desire. He didn't want to hurt her, and she was being so brazen, he was becoming aroused much faster than he'd expected. He carefully maneuvered her so her back was to the bed and lowered her gently down, moving to lie on his side. "I need you," he whispered against her neck. She turned her head to him, stroking his bare shoulders and the sinewy muscles there. "You feel good." "So do you." His lips kissed a trail from her shoulder down to her breast, carefully taking her nipple between his lips and pulling it into his mouth. She gasped, grasping his shoulders more tightly. She had never imagined he'd suckle at her breasts the way a babe did. The motion sent a spark of fire flying through her body and into her most secret place. She felt her legs part slightly of their own accord, and his hand moved between her spread thighs, straight to her core. Constance wasn't certain if his hand was supposed to touch her there, and if it was all right, but she didn't argue. Instead, she ran her fingers through his dark hair, touching him with loving fingers. "I want you," she whispered to him. His hand traced the tight nub he found between her secret folds, before slowly inserting one finger inside her. "You're so tight. I'm afraid I'm going to hurt you." "The first time always hurts for a woman," she told him. She didn't add that it was his sister who had imparted that small piece of wisdom to her. "Not as much as it will if I take you now." He carefully moved 2 fingers inside her, imitating the motions that he would be making later with his fingers. "I want it to be as easy for you as it can be." Constance smiled. "That's one of the things I love so much about you. You put my needs first." Charles lifted his head, looking down into her eyes. "You love me?" She shook her head with a smile. "What did you think this was all about? I wouldn't marry a man I don't love." She didn't expect to hear the words back, because she knew they were more rare with his class, but she was determined not to care. She loved him, and she couldn't hide it from him any longer. Charles kissed her lips softly. "I feel like I've been waiting my whole life to hear those words." He rolled between her legs and reached down a hand to guide himself to her core. "I love you." He plunged into her just as he gave her the words she so desperately needed to hear. Constance clutched his shoulders as she felt him push through her maidenhead and deep into her body. She cried out softly with the pain, staring up into his eyes. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. Did I hurt you?" He stroked her cheek as he held still within her, waiting for her to adjust to his invasion. "Just a little." She pulled his head down for a kiss. "Do you really love me? You're not just saying it because I did?" "Of course I'm not just saying it. I love you more than I've ever loved anyone in my life." He rubbed his thumb across her lips. "My whole life I've wanted a real love, not just someone who would do her duty and bear children for me. I knew the moment I saw you at my sister's house, you were my real love." She sighed happily, content that he loved her, even though she knew then she would never enjoy this part of marriage. She could close her eyes and let him have his way. She was disappointed, though. She'd hoped for so much more with him. "I knew the first time I saw you on your horse." "Are you feeling better now? Does it still hurt?" She thought about that for a moment. "No, it doesn't hurt anymore. I just feel full." "Just so you're not in pain." His mouth dipped to cover hers as he began moving inside her. Constance waited for the pain to continue, but she was surprised to feel only pleasure. His motions felt good to her, not bad, which surprised her to no end. After the initial shock of his invasion, she'd thought she'd only receive pain from doing this. Within moments, she was not only putting up with his invasion, but enjoying it immensely. Each stroke of his body in and out of hers made her quiver with pleasure. She felt her body clenching as if something was about to happen. She didn't know what, but whatever it was, it felt good. Her body began to quiver as she tightened around him, calling out his name as she reached her climax. Charles let himself go as soon as she did, finishing soon after her. He rolled to his side and pulled her into his arms, kissing her forehead and holding her as if she were a precious object. "Thank you for being my wife, even though I was so rude to you at first." She shook her head. "You were never rude to me." He sighed. "I asked the woman that I love to be my mistress." "That was rude. I should have known right away that you could only be my wife." "I don't know what I was thinking asking you something like that." Constance stroked his cheek, kissing him softly on the lips. "You knew you wanted to spend the rest of your life with me, despite what society would think about that. I appreciate that in a man." He sighed, holding her contentedly. "You are the woman I've waited my entire life for. Thank you for being my wife." Epilogue. Constance sat in her parlor with Lily while the twins played on the floor at their feet. They had just started crawling, so the ladies had placed a chair on its side on the floor to prevent them from escaping. Constance had her feet up on an ottoman, because she knew if Charles came by and she didn't, he would be upset with her. Lily smiled, eyeing her sister-in-law's very pregnant belly. "I can't wait until you give the girls a cousin or two. Maybe you're having twins too." Constance shook her head. "Why would you wish that on me?" She couldn't believe after the trouble Lily had when her babies were first born that she would want anyone else to have to go through the chaos that was the first few months of life with twins. Charles stood outside the parlor door, his hand on the door jamb, trying to decide if he wanted to scale the small wall his sister had erected. "Are you trying to keep me out or the babies in?" he asked. Lily turned to him with a grin. "The babies in, of course." She winked at him. "Constance would never forgive me if I blocked you out. She's partial to you for some absurd reason." Charles stepped over the chair barricade and walked to sit on the sofa beside his wife. "What brings you here anyway?" he asked his sister rudely. Lily shrugged. "I figured you missed me so much you couldn't bear to be without me for another minute, so I packed up my babies and came over." He eyed her skeptically. "Is it the nurse's day off again?" Lily blushed so deeply, he knew immediately he'd hit on the problem. "Constance isn't your nurse anymore." Lily shook her head. "That's not it at all. I don't need help with the babies. Well, I do, but that's not why I'm here. I came by to see Constance, because I hate being alone on days that Kit is off somewhere else. It's his day to help out at the orphanage." Charles settled onto the sofa and slipped his arm around his wife's shoulders, dragging her to his side. "I guess that's all right then. I do think it's noble to love your husband so much you can't bear to be without him." "You would." Constance chuckled softly. "I sure can tell you two are siblings." She patted her belly. "I hope this is only one, but I need to have at least 2 or 3 children. Not for the heir and a spare thing. I couldn't care less about that." "Not nice," Charles told her, although he said it with a twinkle in his eye. "I want more than one, so my child can have a sibling. Watching you two together, and James when he's around, it makes me realize everything I missed out on by not having any siblings of my own." Lily looked at Charles with a baffled look. "Do you say nice things about me when I'm not around or something?" "Never." Constance just laughed. The love between the siblings was almost as obvious as the love between her and Charles, and between Lily and Kit. She would spend the rest of her life having babies if that's what it took for her children to have the kind of camaraderie. She couldn't wait. Curious about Lily and Kit's story? Read on for an excerpt from Loving Lily. Prologue. May, 1799. Lily was 6 when she met the boy she knew she would love for the rest of her life. Not many 6-year-olds would recognize something like that, but Lily was more aware than most. She'd sneaked off to run through the woods barefoot, which was her favorite springtime fun. Of course, her father didn't consider that a worthy pursuit for a young lady. He wanted her to spend her days in the nursery with her nanny, learning to embroider and act like a lady. He didn't much like her climbing trees either, but that had never stopped her. Through the trees, she saw him, high atop his horse. He was with an older gentleman who she later learned was his father. He followed along after his father, but when his father got off his horse to speak with hers, he dismounted, and followed the trail into the woods instead. When she saw him coming her way, she scurried up the nearest tree as agilely as any monkey. She sat on one of the branches just over the path and watched as he walked below her. If he'd looked up, he'd have seen her bare foot dangling over his head, but he didn't look up. Lily had to cover her mouth to keep her giggles from being too loud, but still he heard her. He walked back to where she sat in the tree, looking up at her. "Who are you?" She had never talked to a strange boy before. She talked to her older brothers, of course, but they were off at Eton now. She didn't have much chance to leave their family's estate, so she rarely had the opportunity to talk to anyone to whom she wasn't related. Except the servants, of course. Not that she was complaining. She loved the area surrounding her home. It was a child's fantasy land. She stared down at him for a moment and decided answering wouldn't hurt her. "I'm Lily. This is my family's land." "Oh, my dad came here to see your dad then." "He's the Earl?" She nodded. "Yeah, and Mama was the Countess. She died, though. I killed her." She whispered the last words as if they were some sort of sinful secret. "How'd you kill her?" he asked, fascinated by this little girl. He was 10, and soon to be off to Eton, but he considered himself almost grown up compared to this little thing. She shrugged. I didn't mean to. It happened when I was born. Oh. That just happens sometimes. It's not your fault she died. Lily's eyes widened. It's not? He shook his head. No. Did someone tell you it was your fault? No, but they sometimes look at me like they blame me. I'm sure no one blames you. He looked up at her for a moment before asking, do you need help down from there? Lily looked around her. She climbed this tree all the time. She didn't need help. But he looked so strong and willing. Maybe she should let him help her down. Her nanny was always telling her that gentlemen liked ladies who were helpless. Yes, please. She scooted across the branch to the trunk, and wrapped her arms around it like usual. She put her foot on the knot and scurried down. She was beside him before she remembered she was supposed to let him help her. She gave him a perplexed look. I'm sorry. I forgot to let you help. I can climb it again, so you can help me down. He laughed. Now. It looks like you've got it figured out. He started walking deeper into the woods. How come you're not up in the nursery? Are you supposed to be out here? She shook her head. Papa would be very disappointed in me if he knew I was here. He thinks ladies should practice embroidery and always look perfect. She looked down at her bare feet. And always wear shoes. Well, I don't think you're any less a lady than you would be with shoes on, he said courteously. Thank you. She knew then she loved him. She wanted to marry him. Of course, she'd have to wait until she was older. Wait, could she marry a man whose name she didn't know? How could she tell Papa which man she wanted? You never told me your name. Christopher. My brothers call me Kit. He liked the nickname, but his father wouldn't use it. Of course, father wasn't very interested in him anyway. His oldest brother, Jack, was the heir. His brother Harold was the spare. He was the spare's spare, and no one needed a spare for their spare. May I call you Kit? I'd like that. She was a funny little thing. She spoke as if she were already grown. Her red hair was braided and hung down her back. Her eyes were what really enchanted him, though. They were the same shade of green as the leaves. How many brothers do you have? I have 2. They're at Eton now. She jabbered on as they walked. 2. The oldest, Jack, is at Cambridge. My other brother, Hal, is at Eton. I go to Eton next year, he added importantly. I don't get to go away to school. I hate being a girl sometimes. She kicked a rock out of her way as they wandered along. He caught her arm. You'd look awful funny in that dress if you were a boy, he told her. When she grinned up at him, he knew it had been the right thing to say. We'd better turn around and go back. My father won't like it if he can't find me when it's time to go. I'm glad I met you. Was that a good way to tell him to come back when she was old enough to get married? They walked silently for a while. Finally, the house was within sight through the trees. I have to go find my shoes and sneak back to the nursery before Nanny wakes up from her nap. He grinned. Is that how you got out? That's how I get out every day. She held out her hand. It was a pleasure meeting you. The words had been pounded into her head so many times she could never forget to say them. He bowed over her hand, kissing her knuckles. I hope to see you again, my lady. She giggled softly. I hope so too, Kit. She turned and ran in the direction of the servants' entrance. It was the only way to get in without being noticed. She sat on the floor and pulled her shoes on, running up the stairs. She was sitting on her bed, playing with a porcelain doll she'd gotten for her birthday when Nanny woke up to check on her. Nanny didn't mention the dirt on her dress as she changed her. Just as she knew that Lily wouldn't mention her nap to her father. Chapter 1. June 1811. Lily sat through the long process of having her hair fixed just right. Her father insisted it was time for her debut in a few months, but talked him into a small house party first. Not that she was nervous about her first season in London. It was just that she wanted to see if it could be avoided. Kit should be finished with university this year. Maybe he would be there. He would sweep her off her feet, and Papa would agree there was no need for a season when she'd already found her true love. He'd offer a huge dowry, because as a third son, Kit would need it, and they would live happily ever after. She hadn't seen him since that day in the woods, but she remembered him perfectly. He had hair that was so dark it was almost black and the warmest brown eyes she'd ever seen. What else did she really need to know? Ow. Be careful, Bernice. I want to have some hair left for the party, she joked. In truth, her maid had become her closest friend. She knew Papa would cringe if she ever said such a thing aloud, but there were no other young ladies around for her to befriend. I'm sorry, Lady Lily. We're alone. How many times do I have to tell you to drop the formalities when we're alone? Sorry. Are you almost finished? Lily knew she should be more patient, but it wasn't in her nature. She couldn't stand sitting still and doing nothing. She'd still rather be running barefoot through the woods than anything else in the world. Papa had finally asked his sister, Aunt Margaret, to come live with them. Margaret was a widow and a stickler for rules of propriety. Papa was certain Aunt Margaret could tame her. Lily sighed as she looked down at her hands. She may not have been tamed, but she certainly knew how to pretend she was. Yes. Your hair is going to look glorious. Lily smiled. It had to look perfect for Kit. She knew she shouldn't count on him coming, but she'd seen his father several times over the years as he'd come to do business with hers. Surely his family would be invited. Finally, her hair finished, she stood to allow Bernice to help her into her dress. It was made of silk and a deep forest green. It matched her eyes perfectly. When she was dressed, she looked into the mirror and sighed, yes, that's just right. She turned and threw her arms around her maid. Thank you. My hair is just like Mama's in the portrait in the hall. I'm glad you like it. Bernice hugged her back for a moment, and then walked in a slow circle around her, trying to be sure everything was just right. Remember not to kick your shoes off. Lily sighed. I hate shoes. And these new slippers pinch my toes. My dress is so long, what difference would it make if I danced without them? Bernice laughed. Your papa would have my head. You have to behave like a lady. Just this once. I'll try. Lily looked down at the floor as she said the words. She knew she was the bane of her father's existence. He wanted her to be the perfect lady and marry well. She didn't care if she married well, as long as she married Kit. Her father knocked on her door. Are you ready, Lily? Yes, Papa. She walked to the door and took his arm. Tonight she would be presented to the people at the small country dance her father had her aunt arrange. She walked as gracefully as possible to the top of the stairs. They descended slowly. She kept her chin up the entire time as she'd been taught. Finally they reached the bottom, and he presented her to a young man who immediately took her arm and twirled her away in a dance. She'd have to wait until she got to London and was given permission before she danced the waltz, but she'd had a dance teacher come to teach her all of the dances she could possibly be expected to dance, both here and in London. She made small talk with the young man she danced with, trying to keep her eyes on his face to show she was interested in what he had to say, but her eyes were constantly searching the room. Was Kit here? Would she even be able to recognize him if he was? It had been 12 years since their first meeting. Surely, he would have changed in that time. She knew she had. She curtsied politely at the end of the dance and the young man returned her to her father. She thanked him sweetly for the dance. Her father then presented her to the man she knew was Kit's father. Lily, this is the Viscount Burgess. She smiled. Were his sons with him? I'd like you to meet my sons. This is Jack, my eldest. Lily held out her hand for him to kiss. Jack looked faintly as if he could be related to Kit. It's nice to meet you. Jack nodded. The pleasure is mine. Viscount Burgess indicated the young man on his other side. This is my second son, Harold. It's nice to meet you, Mr. Burgess. She held her hand out for him as well. She couldn't help but wonder if the brothers felt like they were kissing one another as they each kissed the same spot on her hand. And you, Lady Lily. His eyes met hers and she smiled. He had the same eyes as Kit. She looked at the Viscount expectantly waiting for him to introduce Kit. Was he here? And are these your only sons? Her father glanced at her reprovingly. She knew she shouldn't have said it, but she had to know if Kit was there. No, my third son is. Where is Christopher anyway? He turned to his eldest son to ask that. He's standing right behind you, father. Jack gestured to the young man behind him. Ah, yes. Here we are. My third son, Christopher. Lily raised her eyes expectantly. Did he remember her? She held her hand out to the man in question. Lady Lily. It's wonderful to meet you. His eyes danced as he brought her fingers to his lips. Would you care to dance? Lily smiled. I'd love to. He looked older, of course, but the laughter was still there in his chocolate eyes. She gripped the muscle of his arm through his black jacket, and knew she was holding him too tightly, but she didn't care. She was keeping this man. I hoped you'd come, she whispered just loudly enough for him to hear. He smiled. I wouldn't have stayed away. I wasn't sure you'd remember me. He paused for a moment. You were very young the first time we met. How could I forget you, Kit? She paused for a moment, knowing that she should be making polite conversation when all she wanted to do was beg him to ask her father for her hand. Are you finished with your studies now? Finally. I won't say I didn't enjoy them, because I did, but I'm happy to be finished. What will you do now? She asked. He shrugged. Honestly, I'm not entirely certain. I do hope to marry, though. He stared deep into her eyes as he said those words. Soon. She smiled. Do you have a bride picked out then? She only wanted one answer, of course. If he gave any other, she may very well throw a temper tantrum right there on the dance floor. She smiled to herself. Wouldn't her aunt and father be surprised at that? He nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. If she'll have me, of course. You see, I've known for years the kind of wife I wanted. Really? Tell me about her. Well, she has to have copper-colored hair. And forest green eyes. And, this is the most important part. He leaned forward as if he were imparting a secret. She felt herself drawn to him as if by a magnet. She leaned in for the last part. What? She must hate to wear shoes on warm spring days, he whispered. She laughed aloud. I tried to convince my aunt that I would be a more graceful dancer without slippers, and told her that I shouldn't wear them tonight. She flicked up the hem of her gown to show him the slippers that peeked out from under. Alas, I lost that argument. He chuckled. Those don't look too terribly confining, he said. They pinch my toes. I hate shoes. She sounded so forlorn that he was tempted to get to his knees and remove her slippers right there and then. He wished he could pull her to him for a kiss then, but knew it would never do. Not here. Will you meet me tonight? She knew it wasn't proper. She knew the correct answer was a loud no and a dressing down. Instead, she heard herself whisper, what time and where? In the woods, under the tree where I first met you. The party should be over at midnight, so shall we say 1? She nodded. She knew she shouldn't, but she didn't care. This was Kit, and she was going to marry him. They didn't dance together again that evening. It wouldn't have been proper, and with her father watching her so closely, she knew that propriety was important. She danced with all the young bachelors there, and even some of the older ones. She knew they were all interested in the generous dowry they expected her father to settle on her. It was a long night, and the only thing that kept her going was the promise of stolen time with Kit at the end of it. Oh, she wouldn't have to have a London season after all. She'd be engaged before she had to go off and live in the hustle and bustle of the city. She was a country girl, and although Hyde Park sounded nice, there was nothing else the city had to offer that she wanted. Bernice helped her undress at the end of the long evening. She had already picked out a day dress in her mind that she would wear when she sneaked out to meet Kit. Bernice left her all tucked up in her bed, feigning sleep. As much as she trusted Bernice, Lily knew her friend was paid by her father. She couldn't trust her with a secret this big. She couldn't trust anyone with a secret this big. After the door closed behind her maid, Lily counted to 100 slowly. She wanted to be sure she gave her enough time to come back in if she was going to. Finally, she flung the covers back and quickly threw off her nightgown. She flipped through her closet until she found the dress she wanted and slipped it over her head. She'd made sure to choose one that buttoned in the front so she wouldn't need help. She was halfway down the back stairs when she realized that she'd forgotten her shoes. She still wore them as seldom as she could get away with. She laughed. Kit wouldn't mind. She walked quickly across the lawn and spotted him under the tree he had designated as their meeting place. As soon as she saw him, she slowed her walk, watching him as he stood under the tree, waiting for her. His focus was on the tree limb above him, so he didn't see her as she approached. With her bare feet, she made no sound. Finally, she was close enough to touch him and did just that. Her hand reached out to his arm and gave it a light squeeze. He turned to her with a smile, taking her hand and pulling her deeper into the woods. Finally, he stopped and turned to her, setting down the lantern he'd carried with him. "When was the last time you climbed that tree?" he asked, nodding in the direction they'd come from. She shrugged. "Last week, I think," she answered honestly. She smiled up at him sweetly. "I've outgrown climbing trees in my old age." He pulled her into his arms slowly, his head lowering to hers. It was her first kiss, and she was eager for it. She pressed her lips to his and wrapped her arms around his shoulders. "Open your mouth," he whispered against her lips. She gasped in surprise at his words, but it was enough. His head swooped down again and his tongue found entrance. His hands pulled her close against him, and she felt a jolt of surprise. Was it okay to kiss this way? Surely not. Her aunt had told her to let no man kiss her until after she was married, and then only her husband. Her aunt had set herself up as the moral gauge in Lily's life. Lily chose to ignore her whenever possible. After a moment, he trailed his lips to her ear, whispering softly, "I want you to be my wife." She clung to his shoulder tightly. "Talk to my father." She knew her father would accept Kit. He was a gentleman after all. And her father wanted her to be happy. Do you think he'd accept? Me being a third son and all? He had no clue how he'd support a wife, but he didn't care. He had some money, and they could live with his family for a time. Whatever it took, as long as he had this woman by his side, he knew that life would be good. He hadn't gone to the party planning to marry her. He wondered if she'd even remember him. He'd half expected to meet the pretty little girl from the woods, but in her place was a beautiful woman. He'd deliberately hidden himself behind her father so he could observe her unnoticed. At first, he'd been certain her father had finally managed to crush her impish spirit, which had saddened him for reasons he couldn't explain. Then, he'd had to work to prevent himself from laughing when she demanded to know if his father had presented all of his sons. In truth, his father probably wouldn't have gotten around to introducing him. He was a third son, after all, and not expected to marry well at all. When he'd stepped forward and taken her hand, he'd known that the happy little hoyden who'd been certain she killed her mother still lived in the well-groomed lady. He knew then, without a shadow of a doubt, that he wanted to marry the lady and raise many more wild little girls who would know their own minds and hate being locked up in the nursery. After a moment, when she hadn't answered, he asked again. "Will your father skewer me alive for daring to ask for his precious daughter's hand?" She laughed. "I think he'll be happy to be rid of me. As long as I'm not marrying the stable lad, of course." He'd actually probably be relieved that he was able to get her married off so easily. He looked grim in the moonlight shining through the branches of the trees overhead. "I'm not the stable lad, but I am a third son. I don't have a title to offer you." She shrugged, truly not caring what he had or who he was. As far as she was concerned, he was Kit and that was good enough for her. They could live in a tree house, for all she cared. She'd probably even like it, she thought with a grin. I don't care one whit about a title. I just want a man who will love me for who I am. That, I will do. He kissed her one last time, and then picked up the lantern. We need to get you back up to the manor. We don't want anyone to notice you're missing. She sighed. I would rather spend the entire night out here with you. She could picture them sleeping on a blanket under the stars. His arms would stay wrapped around her all night long. He would have liked that as well, but for reasons other than what she was thinking. Soon, we'll be able to do that. I'll talk to your father soon. He smiled down at her, trying hard to believe she was interested in marriage to him. She stopped in her tracks. Please kiss me one more time, so I won't think I'm dreaming. He laughed, set the lantern down carefully, and pulled her into his arms. I would never want you to think you were dreaming, love. His lips descended again. This time she needed no coaxing. She opened her mouth to allow his tongue entrance, and met it with her own. Her hands rubbed his shoulders, through the back of his shirt. When he finally lifted his head, they were both breathing hard. I don't know how I'll ever be able to wait until the wedding night, he whispered against her lips. She smiled. She wasn't sure exactly what happened on a wedding night, but she'd seen enough animals mating to have a pretty good idea. It didn't look pleasant, but if it made him happy, she would participate. They walked again through the woods, and he stopped under the tree where they'd met so many years before. Will you meet me here again? Tomorrow night? Of course I will. Her aunt had always told her that a lady didn't show too much enthusiasm when being pursued by a gentleman. Lily didn't care. This wasn't just any man, this was Kit. She wasn't going to put on airs and pretend to be someone she was not. They kissed again, just a brief brush of his lips against hers in farewell, and she dashed across the lawn to the back stairs. Once she was again tucked into her bed, she slept deeply, dreaming of little boys with jet black hair and chocolate brown eyes.